"I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, but we're going to have to let you go." Those 8 words had been echoing in Malik Thompson's mind for the past 72 hours as he stared at the cracked ceiling of his studio apartment in Oakland, watching the morning light filter through blinds that had seen better days about a decade ago. The smell of instant ramen and desperation hung in the air like a fog that refused to lift. No matter how many times he opened the single window that looked out onto a parking lot where broken dreams went to rust. At 23, Malik had already lived more lives than most people twice his age. Each chapter written in the careful handwriting of someone who understood that survival meant never taking anything for granted. The foster care shuffle had taught him that lesson early, and often moving him from house to house, family to family, each placement lasting just long enough for him to start believing maybe this time would be different before the inevitable phone call came, and his few belongings got stuffed back into the same black garbage bag that had become his most reliable companion. But this morning was different, because this morning the phone call that had shattered his carefully constructed world hadn't come from a social worker or a placement coordinator. It had come from Detroit General Hospital, where his foster sister Zara was lying in the ICU after a car accident that had left her with internal bleeding and a medical bill that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense it made to a 16-year-old girl with no insurance and no family, except for the brother who was barely keeping his own head above water 3,000 miles away. Malik pulled his worn Stanford hoodie tighter around his shoulders, the fabric soft from too many washes and thin enough that the Oakland morning chill cut right through it like a blade. His aerospace engineering textbooks were stacked on the fold-out table that served as his desk, kitchen counter, and dining room table, their pages filled with equations that could calculate the precise trajectory needed to escape Earth's gravitational pull, but couldn't tell him how to come up with $15,000 for emergency surgery when his bank account was showing a balance that wouldn't cover a decent meal. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was studying how to launch rockets into space while he couldn't even afford to launch himself on a cross-country flight to be with the only person who had ever felt like real family. Zara had been 8 when they'd been placed in the same foster home, small for her age and fierce in the way that only kids who've learned to fight for everything they've ever gotten can be. She'd looked up at him with those big brown eyes that seemed to hold too much wisdom for such a young face, and asked if he was going to leave her too the way everyone else had. He'd promised her then that he would never abandon her, that no matter what happened or where life took them, they would always be each other's family. It was a promise that had sustained him through 4 years of undergraduate work at community college, through the miracle of transferring to Stanford on a full scholarship that had felt like winning the lottery, through endless nights of studying while working 3 jobs to keep his head above water. Everything he'd done, every sacrifice he'd made, every time he'd chosen textbooks over food or sleep over social life. It had all been building toward a future where he could give Zara the kind of stability and security that neither of them had ever known. Now that future was crumbling faster than he could hold it together, and the worst part was the crushing realization that after everything he'd overcome, after all the obstacles he'd bulldozed through with nothing but determination and a stubborn refusal to give up, he was being defeated by something as simple and brutal as money. The research position that had been funding his PhD program was gone, cut in the latest round of university budget slashing, and without that income, without that lifeline, he was looking at dropping out just months before completing his degree. His phone buzzed against the table, the vibration making his coffee mug rattle like chattering teeth. For a moment his heart hammered with the irrational fear that it might be the hospital calling with worse news, but the caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize with a Stanford area code. He almost let it go to voicemail, not sure he could handle another piece of bad news, but something made him swipe to answer. Malik Thompson. The voice was crisp and professional, carrying the kind of authority that made him sit up straighter even though the caller couldn't see him. "Yes, this is Malik." His own voice sounded rough-raw from the phone conversation with Zara's doctor that had left him hoarse from trying not to cry. This is Dr. Sarah Chen from the Innovate Tomorrow Fellowship Committee. I'm calling with some extraordinary news that I hope will change your week considerably. There was a warmth in her tone that cut through his fog of despair, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Your proposal for sustainable aviation fuel using algae bioengineering has been selected not just as a winner of this year's fellowship, but as our top recipient. The grant includes a full $100,000 stipend and immediate funding for your research. Malik felt the world tilt sideways the way it does when you're expecting to step down. But there's one more stare than you thought. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? Did you say 100,000? Dr. Chen's laugh was gentle understanding. I did indeed. But that's not all, Mr. Thompson. Part of the fellowship includes presenting your research at the Global Innovation Summit in Geneva next week. We've arranged first-class accommodations for the trip, including your flight. You'll be presenting alongside some of the most brilliant minds in sustainable technology, and there will be representatives from NASA, SpaceX, and several major aerospace companies in attendance. The phone felt heavy in his hand, like it was made of something denser than plastic, and circuits waited with the sudden possibility that maybe the universe wasn't quite as cruel as he'd started to believe. Dr. Chen, I don't know what to say. This changes everything. Sometimes the best research comes from people who understand what it means to solve real problems, Mr. Thompson. Your work on making aviation sustainable while keeping it accessible to everyone, that's not just brilliant science, it's compassionate science. We need more of that in the world. She paused, and he could hear papers rustling in the background. Your flight to Geneva leaves tomorrow evening from San Francisco International. First class seat 1A. I hope you're ready to show the world what you're capable of. After she hung up, Malik sat in the silence of his tiny apartment for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes watching dust motes dance in the morning light, and trying to process the fact that in the space of one phone call, everything had changed. Zara's surgery was covered. His PhD was saved. His research would be heard by people who could actually implement it on a scale that might help reduce aviation emissions by 30% within the next decade. He pulled up the airline confirmation on his laptop, staring at the words, "First Class," like they were written in a language he was still learning to read. Tomorrow night, he would be sitting in Seat 1A, flying across the Atlantic to present research that could change the world. The boy who had grown up believing he would never be allowed into the places where important decisions were made was about to have a seat at the most important table of all. Victoria Ashworth had never heard the word no spoken with any real conviction, at least not when it was directed at her, which was why the Delta Sky Club attendants' apologetic but firm explanation that they were out of Dom Perignon was hitting her like a personal attack on everything she believed about how the world was supposed to work. What do you mean you're out? Victoria's voice carried the kind of sharp edge that could cut glass honed by 52 years of getting her way through a combination of inherited wealth and the sort of entitlement that money can't buy but seems to create all by itself. Her platinum blonde hair was lacquered into submission, every strand precisely placed in a style that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her Chanel suit was the kind of pristine white that required both courage and complete certainty that the world would bend itself around you rather than risk leaving a stain. The attendant, a young woman named Rebecca, whose name tag was slightly crooked in a way that Victoria found personally offensive, maintained her professional smile with the kind of determination usually reserved for hostage negotiations. I apologize for the inconvenience, Mrs. Ashworth. We do have several other excellent champagne options available, including Cristal and Krug, both of which I think you'll find quite exceptional. Victoria's fingers tightened around her Hermes Birkin bag, the leather creaking like a warning shot. The bag had cost $40,000 and served less as a fashion accessory than as a portable declaration of war against anyone who might dare to treat her like an ordinary person. You think I'll find them exceptional? Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? I am Victoria Ashworth. My late husband Harrison built half the skyscrapers in Manhattan. I sit on the boards of 3 Fortune 500 companies, and I've been a Diamond Medallion member of this airline for longer than you've been alive. Behind Victoria, her assistant, Miranda Chen, stood with the sort of practiced invisibility that comes from years of learning to anticipate and deflect her employer's volcanic moods. At 28, Miranda had graduated from Wharton with an MBA and dreams of changing the corporate world, only to find herself instead becoming an expert in the care and feeding of a woman whose primary talent seemed to be transforming minor inconveniences into major international incidents. Miranda's arms were loaded with shopping bags from their pre-flight expedition through the airport's luxury retail corridor, each bag representing Victoria's attempt to fill some void that no amount of money ever seemed to quite reach. The Gucci bag contained a handbag that Victoria had decided she needed after seeing it in a magazine. The Tiffany bag held a bracelet that she'd bought because the saleswoman had taken slightly too long to bring her a different bracelet to examine. The Louis Vuitton bag was filled with scarves that she would never wear but had purchased because the act of buying them had made her feel powerful in a moment when a traffic jam had made her feel helpless. Of course, Mrs. Ashworth Rebecca was saying, her smile growing slightly more strained around the edges. I completely understand your preference. Please let me check with our manager to see if there might be a bottle available in our reserve collection. Victoria watched the young woman hurry away with the sort of satisfaction that comes from watching the world rearrange itself according to your will. But it was a hollow victory, the kind that left her feeling somehow emptier than she'd felt before. The truth that she would never admit to anyone, least of all herself, was that the champagne didn't actually matter. What mattered was the moment of power, the brief confirmation that she still existed at the center of her own universe, that the rules that applied to everyone else somehow curved around her like light bending around a black hole. She turned her attention to the Sky Club lounge, her eyes sweeping across the assembled travelers with the sort of critical assessment that a general might use to survey enemy territory. The usual collection of business travelers hunched over their laptops, families corralling excited children, the occasional celebrity trying to blend in behind oversized sunglasses, and the kind of studied casualness that screamed for attention while pretending to avoid it. But what caught her attention, what made her lips purse in the sort of disapproval that she usually reserved for service workers who forgot their place, was the increasing number of people in the lounge who simply didn't look like they belonged there. A young Hispanic family with children who were being too loud, their laughter cutting through the carefully maintained atmosphere of subdued luxury. An elderly black gentleman in a worn but clean suit reading a book with fingers that showed the calluses of manual labor. A group of Asian students sharing what looked like homemade sandwiches instead of ordering from the premium menu. Standards. Victoria murmured to Miranda, her voice pitched low but not so low that nearby passengers couldn't hear if they were listening. They've completely abandoned any sense of standards. Anyone with a credit card thinks they can just buy their way into places like this, and the staff is too afraid of being called discriminatory to maintain any sense of exclusivity. Miranda shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the shopping bags cutting into her arms less than the weight of her employer's casual bigotry cut into her conscience. She'd heard variations of this speech before, usually delivered in the sort of code that allowed Victoria to express her prejudices while maintaining plausible deniability. It was never about race, according to Victoria. It was about class, about standards, about the kind of people who understood how to behave in civilized society versus those who needed to be taught their place. Your champagne, Mrs. Ashworth. Rebecca had returned with a bottle that probably cost more than Rebecca's weekly salary, her professional smile now reinforced with the sort of grim determination that comes from dealing with difficult customers as part of your daily routine. Victoria accepted the champagne without acknowledgement, as if its appearance was simply the natural order of the universe reasserting itself, rather than the result of a young woman going above and beyond to accommodate an unreasonable demand. She sipped it with the sort of critical attention that wine experts might reserve for evaluating a vintage, though her palate had been deadened years ago by the kind of casual consumption that treats luxury as a baseline rather than a privilege. Better, she announced, as if the quality of the champagne had been in question rather than its availability. Though I shouldn't have had to ask twice. Service has really declined everywhere, hasn't it? People just don't understand the importance of maintaining proper standards anymore. The boarding announcement for Flight 847 to Geneva crackled over the lounge's sound system, and Victoria rose from her seat with the sort of imperial grace that she'd learned from watching old Hollywood movies where rich women glided rather than walked. Today she would be flying first class to Geneva, where she would attend a pharmaceutical industry conference and deliver a keynote speech about market innovation that would carefully avoid mentioning the price-hiking scandals that had made her company billions while making life-saving medications unaffordable for thousands of patients. She had no idea that in Seat 1, a directly next to her assigned Seat 1B, would be sitting exactly the kind of person whose presence in first class would challenge every assumption she'd ever made about who belonged where in the world's carefully ordered hierarchy. San Francisco International Airport at sunset was a cathedral of glass and steel, its soaring ceilings catching the last golden light of day and scattering it across the faces of thousands of travelers whose lives were about to intersect in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. Gate 94 hummed with the controlled chaos of an international departure, the sort of organized complexity that modern air travel demanded and somehow managed to deliver, despite the countless variables and human factors that could derail everything in an instant. Malik Thompson stood at the edge of the boarding area, his carry-on bag gripped in hands that were steadier than he felt watching the parade of first-class passengers who were being invited to board ahead of the general crowd. These were people who moved through the world with a different kind of confidence than he'd ever possessed, the sort of assurance that came from never having to wonder whether you belonged somewhere or worry about whether someone might question your right to take up space. His backpack was new, still bearing the faint outline of price tags he'd carefully removed, purchased yesterday with part of the fellowship advance, because his old one had finally surrendered to years of hard use with a zipper failure that had scattered his textbooks across the Stanford library floor. The blazer he wore was borrowed from his roommate Marcus, a fellow graduate student whose father was a lawyer and whose mother was a doctor, and who'd grown up understanding that clothes were armor in a world that judged you before you opened your mouth. First-class passengers and Diamond Medallion members, we'd like to welcome you aboard Flight 847 with service to Geneva, the gate agent announced, her voice cutting through the terminal noise with practiced efficiency. We'll begin boarding at this time through door 1. Malik checked his boarding pass for what felt like the 100th time since leaving his apartment, the paper slightly soft now from nervous handling. Seat 1. A first class. The letters and numbers seemed almost fictional, like someone had printed them there as a joke that he hadn't quite understood yet. He'd never flown first class before, had barely flown at all except for the one trip to a conference in Chicago where he'd been crammed into a middle seat in the very last row and had spent 4 hours with his knees pressed against his chest. As he approached the boarding gate, he noticed an elderly gentleman ahead of him struggling with a carry-on bag that seemed determined to resist being wheeled in a straight line. Without thinking, Malik stepped forward and gently took hold of the bag's handle, steadying it as the man regained his balance. "Thank you, young man," the gentleman said, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been European, his eyes kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. These wheels seemed to have developed a mind of their own. He was probably in his 70s, with silver hair and the sort of dignified bearing that spoke of a life well lived and stories worth telling. "Happy to help," Sir Malik replied, making sure the bag was stable before releasing it. "Travel safe." The elderly man smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. "Dr. Abraham Fisher," he said, extending his hand. And something tells me this flight is going to be more interesting than either of us expects. They boarded together, making casual conversation about the weather and their destinations, Dr. Fisher mentioning something about attending a human rights conference while Malik shared his nervous excitement about presenting his research. The jet bridge was crowded with the usual mix of business travelers checking their phones and families juggling children and luggage, everyone moving in the sort of controlled hurry that air travel demanded. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 777 was a revelation, all soft leather and brushed metal with seats that looked more like personal cockpits than anything Malik had ever associated with flying. Each seat was separated by enough space that you could spread out without worrying about invading someone else's territory, and the smell was different too. Not the recycled air and industrial carpet scent of economy class, but something cleaner and more expensive, like a high-end hotel lobby. Flight attendant James Parker was waiting at the entrance to the cabin, his uniform crisp and his smile genuine in a way that immediately put Malik at ease. James had been flying for 12 years, had worked his way up from regional airlines to international routes, and had developed the kind of intuition about passengers that came from dealing with every possible combination of human behavior at 35,000 feet. "Welcome aboard," James said, checking Malik's boarding pass with the sort of professional efficiency that made the process feel seamless. Seat 1. "Right up here by the window. Can I help you with your bag?" "I think I can manage." "Thank you," Malik said, though he appreciated the offer more than James could probably know. There was something about being treated with the same courtesy that every other first-class passenger received that made him feel like maybe he really did belong here, like maybe this wasn't some elaborate mistake that would be discovered and corrected at any moment. He found his seat and settled in, pulling out his tablet to review his presentation notes one more time. The research was solid, revolutionary even, but he couldn't shake the imposter syndrome that whispered in the back of his mind that everyone at the conference would take one look at him and know that he was just a foster kid from Oakland who had gotten lucky, who didn't really have the credentials or the background to be sitting at the same table as the world's leading aerospace engineers. The cabin was filling up around him, first-class passengers settling into their seats with the sort of practiced ease that came from frequent travel and unlimited budgets. Business executives pulled out laptops and phones, preparing to work through the flight. A couple in their 60s was quietly debating restaurant reservations in Geneva. A woman in an expensive-looking suit was directing a harried-looking assistant while simultaneously managing what appeared to be 3 different phone conversations. Captain Elena Rodriguez was completing her pre-flight checks in the cockpit, running through the same routine she'd followed for 15 years and thousands of flights. At 48, she was one of the most senior pilots at the airline, a former Navy aviator who had transitioned to commercial aviation after serving 2 tours in Afghanistan. Her parents had immigrated from Mexico when she was 5, working double shifts in restaurants and factories to give their daughter opportunities they'd never had, and Elena never forgot that every flight she commanded was a tribute to their sacrifice. She believed deeply in the responsibility that came with holding people's lives in her hands, not just their physical safety, but their dignity as human beings. The cockpit might be her domain, but the cabin was a microcosm of society, and how they treated each other up there reflected something important about who they all were down here. As Elena completed her final checks and prepared for boarding to conclude, she had no way of knowing that in the next few minutes a woman would board her aircraft whose sense of entitlement would transform what should have been a routine flight into a test of everything she believed about justice, courage, and the responsibility that came with authority. Victoria Ashworth was about to meet Seat 1B, and the collision between her world and Malik's world would create ripples that would spread far beyond the boundaries of first-class, challenging assumptions about power and privilege that had gone unchallenged for far too long. The atmosphere in first class shifted the moment Victoria Ashworth entered the cabin, as if the very air molecules rearranged themselves to accommodate her presence and found the task more difficult than it should have been. She swept through the entrance with Miranda trailing behind her like a pack mule laden with the shopping bags that represented Victoria's attempt to buy her way out of the vague dissatisfaction that followed her everywhere, like a shadow she couldn't quite escape. Victoria's eyes immediately began their customary scan of the cabin, cataloging the other passengers with the sort of critical assessment that a food critic might use to evaluate a restaurant's worthiness. She noted the elderly gentleman in 2A with approval, clearly educated, well-dressed, the sort of person who understood proper behavior. The business executive in 3A was acceptable, his expensive suit and gold watch marking him as someone who belonged in this rarefied space. But when her gaze reached seat 1A, everything stopped. Time seemed to crystallize around the moment of recognition, or rather the moment of profound misrecognition as her brain struggled to process what she was seeing with what she believed should be there. A young black man in a borrowed blazer and new backpack, hunched over a tablet with the sort of intense concentration that suggested either very important work or very elaborate entertainment. His worn sneakers a stark contrast to the pristine leather of the seat he occupied. To Victoria, whose worldview had been carefully constructed over decades to maintain rigid boundaries between people like her and people like everyone else, the sight was not just surprising, but personally offensive, as if someone had moved the furniture in her living room without permission. Malik was completely absorbed in his presentation, running through the slides one more time and making small adjustments to his speaking notes, unaware that he was being subjected to the sort of scrutiny usually reserved for suspicious packages in airport security lines. His research on algae-based sustainable aviation fuel represented 3 years of 18-hour days, countless failed experiments, and the sort of breakthrough thinking that could revolutionize air travel while reducing carbon emissions by 30% within the next decade. "Excuse me." Victoria's voice cut through the cabin's peaceful atmosphere like a fire alarm going off in a library, sharp enough to make James Parker look up from his pre-flight checklist and immediately assess the situation with the sort of professional radar that good flight attendants develop after years of managing human behavior in confined spaces. Malik looked up from his tablet, blinking as his mind shifted from the complex chemical formulas he'd been reviewing to the present moment, where a woman in an expensive white suit was standing in the aisle next to his seat with an expression that he couldn't quite read, but that made something cold settle in his stomach. "Yes, ma'am." Malik's voice carried the sort of automatic politeness that had been drilled into him by years of foster care, where causing trouble could mean finding yourself back in the system with even fewer options than you'd started with. "Can I help you with something?" Victoria's smile was the sort that never reached her eyes, the kind that people use when they're about to deliver bad news with the pretense of being helpful. "I think there might be some confusion about the seating arrangements. You're in seat 1. Malik glanced down at his boarding pass, feeling that familiar flutter of anxiety that came whenever someone in authority questioned his right to be somewhere. "Yes, ma'am, that's my seat. Is there a problem?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that hadn't quite started burning yet, but was definitely smoldering. Other passengers were beginning to notice the interaction, the sort of gradual awareness that spreads through confined spaces when something unusual is happening. Dr. Fisher, seated in 2A, lowered his book and watched with the sort of careful attention that comes from having lived through enough history to recognize when it's about to repeat itself. "Well," Victoria said, her voice taking on the sort of tone that people use when they're explaining something to a child who should already understand it, "I just want to make sure you're in the right place. First class can be confusing if you're not used to it, and sometimes people get turned around or misread their boarding passes." James Parker was already moving toward them, his professional instincts telling him that whatever was happening needed to be managed before it escalated beyond his ability to handle it quietly. He'd seen this kind of interaction before, though usually not quite so blatantly, and he knew that the next few minutes would determine whether this remained a minor misunderstanding or became something that would require captain intervention. Is everything all right here? James asked, his voice carrying the sort of calm authority that comes from years of de-escalating situations while maintaining the delicate balance between customer service and crowd control. Can I help with anything? Victoria turned to James with the sort of relief that comes from finally finding someone who might understand the gravity of the situation. Yes, I think there's been a seating error. This gentleman seems to be confused about where he's supposed to be sitting. Malik felt heat rising in his cheeks, not from anger, but from the kind of deep shame that comes from being publicly questioned about something you have every right to be doing. I'm not confused, he said quietly, holding out his boarding pass for James to see. This is my seat, seat 1 of first class. James examined the boarding pass with the sort of professional thoroughness that made it clear this was a routine part of his job, not a special accommodation for a difficult passenger. The pass was legitimate. The upgrade was legitimate. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the woman in the white suit who seemed determined to turn a non-issue into an international incident. Mr. Thompson's boarding pass is correct, James said, his voice remaining pleasant but taking on a slight edge that suggested the conversation was over. He's in his assigned seat. Signed, Mrs. Ashworth. Your seat is 1B right here next to the window. But Victoria wasn't ready to let it go, couldn't let it go, because admitting that Malik belonged in first class would mean admitting that her carefully constructed worldview might have some cracks in its foundation. I understand what the boarding pass says, but surely you can see why I might be concerned. I paid $12,000 for this seat, specifically for the privacy and the caliber of the environment. The words hung in the cabin like a neon sign impossible to ignore and even more impossible to misinterpret. Dr. Fischer set his book down entirely, his face settling into the sort of grim expression that comes from recognizing an old enemy in a new costume. The business executive in 3A stopped typing on his laptop, his fingers frozen over the keyboard as he processed what he was hearing. Malik felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever someone decided that his presence somewhere was automatically suspicious, the sort of hypervigilance that black men learn to carry like armor that protects them from some dangers while weighing them down with the constant exhaustion of having to prove their right to exist in spaces that others take for granted. Ma'am, James said, his voice now carrying a warning that was polite but unmistakable. I need you to take your seat so we can complete boarding and push back on schedule. Mr. Thompson has every right to be in seat 1. A, just as you have every right to be in seat 1. B. Victoria's face flushed red beneath her carefully applied makeup, the sort of color that comes from having your worldview challenged by someone who's supposed to be providing you with customer service, not customer education. Are you seriously telling me that I have to sit next to someone who clearly doesn't belong in first class? Look at him. Look at his clothes. This is supposed to be a premium experience. The cabin had gone completely silent now, the sort of frozen attention that happens when people realize they're witnessing something that will be remembered long after the flight lands. Miranda stood frozen behind her employer, holding the shopping bags and wishing she could disappear entirely, while James Parker found himself at the center of a moment that would test everything he believed about fairness, professionalism, and the responsibility that came with authority. In the cockpit, Captain Elena Rodriguez was finishing her final pre-flight checks when she heard James's voice over the intercom requesting assistance in the first-class cabin. The tone in his voice told her everything she needed to know about what kind of assistance he needed, and she felt that familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever she was reminded that some battles never really end, they just move to new battlefields. The transformation of Victoria Ashworth from entitled passenger to something far more dangerous happened gradually then, all at once, like the way water freezes by degrees until it suddenly becomes ice, hard and sharp enough to cut. What had started as coded language about standards and confusion began to shed its polite veneer as her frustration with being told no reached a boiling point that 20 years of unchecked privilege had been steadily building toward. This is absolutely unacceptable. Victoria declared, her voice rising to a level that made conversations in economy class pause as passengers craned their necks to see what was happening in the front of the plane. I specifically chose Delta because I was told they maintained certain standards in first class. I was assured that I would be traveling with people of quality, not sitting next to someone who looks like they should be working in the baggage compartment instead of sitting in it. The words hit the cabin like a physical blow, stripping away any remaining pretense about what this confrontation was really about. Malik felt them land in his chest with the force of something he'd experienced before, but had hoped he might have escaped at this altitude, this level of supposed sophistication. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find the center of calm that had gotten him through similar moments in lecture halls and job interviews and scholarship committee meetings where someone had looked at him and seen everything except what he actually was. James Parker felt the situation sliding away from him like sand through his fingers, the sort of moment that every experienced flight attendant dreads, because it represents the point where customer service transforms into crisis management, and where the wrong decision can turn a difficult passenger into a federal incident. He reached for the call button that would summon his supervisor, but before he could press it, another voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Dr. Abraham Fisher's voice carried the weight of authority that comes not from wealth or position, but from having witnessed enough human cruelty to recognize it in all its forms, and having developed zero tolerance for watching it happen without intervention. He stood up from his seat with the careful dignity of a man whose body had aged, but whose spirit remained uncompromised and fixed. Victoria with a stare that held decades of painful wisdom. "I have heard this language before." Young woman Dr. Fisher continued, his slight accent becoming more pronounced as emotion strengthened his voice. "I have heard people speak about others as if their humanity was somehow lesser, as if their right to exist in certain spaces was subject to approval from people who believe themselves superior. I have seen where that kind of thinking leads, and I will not sit silently while it happens again, not in front of me, not anywhere." Victoria whirled on him with the sort of fury that comes from being called out by someone who couldn't be dismissed or intimidated. "How dare you compare this to something historical? This is about maintaining proper standards in a premium service environment. This is about getting what I paid for, which is not having to sit next to someone who clearly doesn't belong here." "And who decides who belongs where?" Dr. Fisher asked quietly, his question cutting through her justifications like a knife through tissue paper. "Who appointed you the guardian of other people's worthiness? This young man has the same boarding pass you do, has paid for the same seat you did, and yet you believe his skin color somehow disqualifies him from occupying that space." Malik finally stood up, not in aggression, but in a sort of weary resignation that came from understanding that this moment had always been inevitable, that no amount of education or achievement or careful behavior would ever be enough to shield him from encounters like this one. "Ma'am," he said to Victoria, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt in his hands. "I'm not looking for any trouble. I'm just trying to get to Geneva to present my research. I earned this seat just like you earned yours." "Earned it?" Victoria's laugh was harsh and bitter, carrying all the contempt that she'd been carefully packaging in polite language for the past 10 minutes. "What could you possibly have earned? What could someone like you have possibly done to deserve to sit in first class? The only way people like you get seats like this is through charity or some diversity program that gives away what other people actually pay for." The cabin erupted in a collective intake of breath, the sort of sound that happens when people witness something so blatantly awful that their brain takes a moment to process that it really happened. James Parker found himself in completely uncharted territory, dealing with language that went far beyond what any customer service training had prepared him for, while passengers throughout the cabin began pulling out their phones to document what was rapidly becoming a viral moment in real time. Lisa Wong, the senior flight attendant, had been working her way forward from the economy cabin when she heard Victoria's voice carrying over the general boarding chaos. The tone unmistakable to someone who'd spent 15 years managing every conceivable form of passenger behavior. She arrived at the first-class section just as Victoria was reaching the crescendo of her tirade, and immediately understood that this was the kind of situation that could define careers and determine whether flights landed safely or were diverted to the nearest airport. Mrs. Ashworth Lisa said, her voice carrying the sort of calm authority that comes from having talked down drunk businessmen and hysterical frequent flyers and every other variety of human being in crisis. "I need you to lower your voice and return to your seat so we can complete the boarding process." Victoria turned her fury on Lisa with the sort of entitled rage that comes from having your tantrum interrupted by someone who refuses to validate your grievances. "Don't tell me to lower my voice. I am the victim here. I am the one being discriminated against. I paid for a first-class experience, and instead I'm being forced to sit next to someone who clearly obtained his seat through some kind of fraud or diversity handout." "Ma'am, that's a serious accusation," Lisa replied, her professional demeanor beginning to crack slightly as she realized they were moving beyond the realm of difficult customers into something that might require law enforcement intervention. "Are you alleging that Mr. Thompson's boarding pass is fraudulent? I'm alleging that there's no way someone like him could afford a first-class ticket to Europe unless someone gave it to him out of pity or political correctness." Victoria shot back, her voice now carrying to the back of the plane, where economy passengers were openly staring and recording with their phones. "Look at his clothes. Look at his shoes. This is clearly some kind of charity case that your airline decided to upgrade to make themselves feel good about their diversity numbers." Malik felt something break inside him. Not the sort of dramatic shattering that happens in movies, but the quiet crack of something that had been bent too many times and finally reached its limit. "You want to know how I earned this seat," he said, his voice still quiet but carrying a new edge that made Victoria take a step back despite herself. "I earned it by spending 3 years developing sustainable aviation fuel that could reduce carbon emissions from air travel by 30%. I earned it by winning the Innovate Tomorrow Fellowship, which comes with a $100,000 grant to fund my research. I earned it by being invited to present my work to NASA and SpaceX engineers at a conference, where they'll be deciding the future of space exploration." The information hit the cabin like a revelation, transforming the dynamic in an instant. As passengers realized they weren't witnessing a case of mistaken identity or charity gone wrong, but rather a brilliant young scientist being attacked by a woman whose only qualification for first class was having been born into enough money to buy her way into spaces where her character clearly didn't belong. Dr. Fischer smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, an expression of quiet satisfaction as he watched Victoria's face process the fact that she had just publicly humiliated herself by attacking someone whose intellectual accomplishments in a single year probably exceeded everything she'd achieved in her entire life. "Perhaps, Mrs. Ashworth," he said gently, "you might want to reconsider who deserves to be sitting where." But Victoria, faced with the complete collapse of her assumptions and the growing realization that she was being recorded by multiple passengers, while making a fool of herself on what was clearly going to become a very public stage, did what entitled people do when their worldview is challenged by facts that don't fit their preconceptions. She doubled down with the sort of desperate fury that comes from watching your entire sense of superiority crumble in real time. "I don't care what kind of scholarship program put you here," she screamed, abandoning any pretense of coded language or plausible deniability. "You still don't belong in first class. You still don't belong anywhere near people like me. And I am not sitting next to some thug who probably stole that research from someone else anyway." The word thug hung in the air like a curse impossible to take back, and even more impossible to misinterpret. And in that moment everyone in the cabin understood that they had just witnessed the sort of naked racism that most people prefer to believe no longer exists in civilized society. James Parker reached for his radio, knowing that this was now beyond his ability to handle, while Lisa Wong began making mental calculations about federal aviation regulations and passenger removal procedures. But before either of them could act, the cockpit door opened with a soft hydraulic hiss, and Captain Elena Rodriguez stepped into the cabin with the sort of purposeful stride that immediately commanded everyone's attention. She had heard enough over the intercom to understand exactly what was happening, and her face carried the expression of someone who had spent 15 years in command and had no intention of allowing her aircraft to become a platform for hatred. Captain Elena Rodriguez had commanded aircraft through thunderstorms over the Pacific, had landed damaged planes in crosswinds that would have terrified seasoned pilots, and had evacuated passengers from a burning terminal during her tour in Afghanistan. But nothing in her 15 years of flying had prepared her for the moment when she would have to choose between customer service protocols and basic human decency, while her aircraft sat at the gate with 300 people watching. The first thing she noticed as she entered the first-class cabin was the quality of the silence, the sort of electric tension that happens when people are witnessing something that will be remembered and retold for years to come. Passengers were holding their phones with the steady hands of people who understood they were documenting history, while others sat frozen with the sort of stunned paralysis that comes from watching someone destroy themselves in public with breathtaking efficiency. The second thing she noticed was Victoria Ashworth herself standing in the aisle with her platinum hair slightly disheveled from her animated, gesturing her expensive white suit rumpled from her dramatic movements. Her face flushed red with the sort of righteous indignation that comes from having your worldview challenged by reality. She looked like a woman who had spent her entire life believing that money could insulate her from consequences and was just beginning to discover how wrong she might have been. The third thing Elena noticed was the young man in seat 1. Sitting with the sort of rigid composure that she recognized from her own experiences as one of the few Latina pilots in commercial aviation, the careful stillness that comes from knowing that any sudden movement or emotional response will be used as evidence against your right to exist in spaces where others take their belonging for granted. His hands were folded in his lap, his shoulders straight, his eyes focused on some point in the middle distance that allowed him to maintain his dignity, while the woman next to him attempted to strip it away. Elena Rodriguez had grown up in East Los Angeles, the daughter of parents who had worked double shifts in restaurants and factories to send their daughter to college and flight school, who had taught her that respect was earned through character and integrity, not inherited through bank accounts and social connections. She had earned her captain's stripes by being twice as good as her male colleagues and half as forgiving of her own mistakes, and she had no patience for people who believed that accident of birth granted them authority over others. "What seems to be the problem here?" Elena asked, her voice carrying the sort of calm authority that immediately shifted the power dynamic in the cabin, transforming the space from Victoria's stage to Elena's cockpit, where different rules applied and different values mattered. Victoria turned toward Elena with the sort of relief that comes from finally seeing someone in uniform who might understand the gravity of her situation. "Captain, thank goodness. I've been trying to explain to your crew that there's been a serious error with the seating arrangements. This person," she gestured toward Malik with the sort of dismissive wave usually reserved for annoying insects, "clearly doesn't belong in first class. And I'm being told that I have to sit next to him despite paying $12,000 for privacy and quality service." Elena looked at Malik, taking in the details that Victoria saw as disqualifying evidence, but that Elena recognized as something entirely different. The nervous energy of someone attending their first major conference, the borrowed blazer that was slightly too big in the shoulders, the new backpack with its crisp corners and unstained fabric, the research materials spread across his tray table covered with equations that Elena couldn't understand, but that clearly represented serious academic work. Mr. Elena paused, waiting for Malik to provide his name. "Thompson." Captain Malik replied, his voice steady despite the ordeal he'd just endured. "Malik Thompson. I'm traveling to Geneva to present research at the Global Innovation Summit." Elena nodded, filing away the information while turning her attention to Victoria with the sort of professional assessment she might use to evaluate weather conditions before takeoff. And you are Mrs. Ashworth. I believe James mentioned that you have concerns about the seating arrangements." "Concerns," Victoria's voice pitched higher with incredulous indignation. "Captain, I have been verbally assaulted and made to feel unsafe by your crew's refusal to address this obvious error. This person clearly obtained his seat through some kind of charity program or diversity initiative, and I should not be forced to sit next to someone who doesn't meet the standards that first-class passengers have every right to expect." Dr. Fisher, who had been watching the interaction with the sort of careful attention that comes from having lived through enough historical moments to recognize their significance, spoke up from his seat in 2A. "Captain, I feel I should mention that I witnessed this entire incident from the beginning. Mrs. Ashworth's accusations are not only unfounded, but represent the sort of prejudice that I had hoped we had moved beyond as a civilized society." Elena looked at the elderly gentleman, noting the numbers tattooed faintly on his forearm that were partially visible beneath his sleeve, understanding immediately what kind of witness she was dealing with and what kind of moral authority his testimony carried. "Dr. Fisher, is it? Thank you for that information." She turned her attention back to Victoria, studying her with the sort of clinical detachment that pilots use to assess mechanical problems that might threaten flight safety. "Mrs. Ashworth, you mentioned that Mr. Thompson obtained his seat through charity or a diversity program. Do you have evidence to support that allegation?" "Evidence," Victoria sputtered as if the question itself was unreasonable. "Look at him. Look at his clothes. Anyone can see that he doesn't belong here. The evidence is obvious to anyone with eyes and common sense." "What I see," Elena said quietly, her voice taking on the sort of edge that made her crew pay attention when she was making decisions that couldn't be questioned, "is a young man with a legitimate boarding pass sitting in his assigned seat while being harassed by a passenger who seems to believe that her ticket price grants her authority over other passengers' right to travel." Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, quickly pulling up the passenger manifest that showed each traveler's booking details, payment method, and any special circumstances related to their travel. What she found confirmed everything she needed to know about who belonged where and why. Mr. Thompson's seat was purchased by the Innovate Tomorrow Fellowship as part of a grant package for academic research. Elena announced, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin so that other passengers could hear the truth that Victoria had been so determined to deny. The booking was paid for in full at the time of reservation and includes a first-class ticket specifically because the fellowship recognizes the importance of ensuring that promising researchers can travel comfortably to present their work at international conferences. The information landed in the cabin like a final piece of evidence in a trial that had already reached its verdict, confirming what most passengers had already begun to suspect about who was the victim and who was the aggressor in this particular drama. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions as she processed the fact that her assumptions had not only been wrong, but had been publicly proven wrong in front of an audience that was still recording every moment. "I don't care how his ticket was paid for," Victoria said, her voice now carrying the sort of desperate edge that comes from realizing you're losing an argument you thought you couldn't lose. "The fact remains that he doesn't belong in first class. He doesn't have the background, the breeding, the class to understand how to behave in this kind of environment. I refuse to sit next to someone like that." Elena Rodriguez felt something crystallize inside her, the same clarity that had guided her through combat missions and emergency landings. The understanding that some moments require you to choose between doing what's easy and doing what's right, and that the choice you make defines not just that moment, but who you are as a person. She looked around the cabin, noting the phones still recording the passengers, still watching the crew members, waiting to see how she would handle a situation that would be remembered and discussed long after the flight landed. She thought about her parents working those double shifts to give their daughter opportunities they'd never had. She thought about every pilot who had come before her and faced similar moments of moral choice. She thought about the responsibility that came with command and the duty that came with authority. Mrs. Ashworth Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of final judgment, "I think we need to discuss your travel plans." The moment before Captain Elena Rodriguez pressed the button on the cabin's public address system, the first-class section of Flight 847 existed in a state of suspended animation, as if the normal laws of time and consequence had been temporarily suspended to allow everyone present to fully appreciate the magnitude of what was about to happen. 300 passengers, most of whom had been following the confrontation through whispered updates and surreptitious phone videos, waited with the sort of collective anticipation usually reserved for natural disasters or sporting events where the outcome would be remembered for generations. Victoria Ashworth stood in the aisle with her hands on her hips, her platinum blonde hair now thoroughly mussed from her animated, gesturing her expensive white Chanel suit bearing wrinkles that would have horrified her under normal circumstances, but which she seemed completely oblivious to in her state of righteous indignation. She had the look of a woman who had spent 52 years believing that the universe would ultimately bend to her will, and who was still confident that this temporary setback would be resolved in her favor once someone in real authority understood the gravity of her situation. Malik Thompson remained in his seat, his research materials still spread across his tray table, his hands folded in his lap with the sort of careful stillness that comes from years of navigating situations where any sudden movement might be interpreted as aggression or disrespect. His borrowed blazer was wrinkled from the stress of the confrontation, and there was a slight tremor in his hands that he was working hard to control, but his eyes remained focused and alert, understanding that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just his immediate future, but possibly the trajectory of his entire career. Dr. Abraham Fisher sat in 2A with his book closed on his lap, his weathered hands resting on its cover, his eyes holding the sort of sad wisdom that comes from having witnessed enough human cruelty to recognize it in all its forms, and enough human courage to still believe that good people would ultimately choose to do the right thing when the moment demanded it. The numbers on his forearm faded now, but still visible to those who knew what to look for, served as a reminder that the battle between dignity and hatred was never really over, just moved to new battlefields with new weapons. Elena Rodriguez held the microphone in her hand for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds running through the calculations that every person in authority must make when faced with a choice between maintaining order and pursuing justice, between following protocols and following conscience. She had commanded aircraft through storms, and emergencies had made split-second decisions that determined whether passengers lived or died. But this moment felt different, because it wasn't about mechanical failure or weather conditions or any of the external factors that pilots train to handle. This was about the kind of human failure that no amount of technical expertise could fix, the sort of moral emergency that required not just professional competence but personal courage. The button clicked under her finger with a sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the silent cabin. And suddenly, Elena's voice filled every corner of the aircraft, reaching not just the first-class passengers who had witnessed the confrontation, but the business travelers in premium economy, and the families in coach, and the flight attendants preparing for departure, all of whom stopped what they were doing to listen to words that would be quoted and discussed and remembered long after Flight 847 reached its destination. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez speaking." Elena began, her voice carrying the sort of calm authority that immediately commanded attention throughout the aircraft. "I want to apologize for the delay in our departure this evening. We have encountered a situation in the first-class cabin that requires my immediate attention and your patience as we resolve it, according to federal aviation regulations and basic standards of human decency." Victoria's expression began to change as the tone of Elena's announcement registered, shifting from confident expectation to confused concern, as she realized that the captain's words didn't seem to be building toward the vindication she had been anticipating. Around the cabin, passengers leaned forward in their seats, understanding that they were about to witness something unprecedented, the sort of moment that would be shared on social media and discussed in airport lounges, and remembered as the flight where someone finally said what needed to be said. Federal aviation regulations grant me the authority to remove any passenger whose behavior threatens the safety and well-being of other passengers or interferes with the duties of the flight crew. Elena continued her words, measured and precise, carrying the weight of legal precedent and moral certainty. This authority exists not just to address physical threats, but to ensure that all passengers can travel with dignity and respect regardless of their race, their background, or their economic circumstances. The cabin was now completely silent except for Elena's voice, with even the mechanical sounds of the aircraft seeming to fade into the background as everyone present understood that they were witnessing a defining moment, the sort of moral clarity that cuts through confusion and reveals fundamental truths about who people really are when their character is tested under pressure. This evening we have had a passenger who believes that her ticket price grants her the authority to determine who else deserves to travel in first class. Elena said, her voice taking on a slight edge that made it clear she was no longer speaking as a customer service representative, but as a person in command, making a decision based on principle rather than profit. This passenger has verbally assaulted a fellow traveler, has used language that any reasonable person would consider discriminatory and offensive, and has disrupted the boarding process for an entire aircraft full of people who simply want to reach their destination safely and with their dignity intact. Victoria's face was now cycling through expressions of disbelief, confusion, and growing horror as the implications of Elena's words began to register. She looked around the cabin for support for someone who might share her perspective, or at least understand her position, but found herself facing a sea of faces that ranged from disgusted to disapproving to openly hostile. Even Miranda, her long-suffering assistant, was staring at her with the sort of dawning comprehension that comes from finally seeing someone clearly after years of making excuses for their behavior. Federal regulations are clear about passenger removal in cases of discriminatory harassment. Elena continued, her voice now carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. When a passenger creates a hostile environment based on racial prejudice, when they use threatening language against fellow travelers, and when they refuse multiple requests from flight crew to modify their behavior, there is only one appropriate response. The pause that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, the entire dynamic of Flight 847 shifted fundamentally and irreversibly, transforming a routine commercial flight into a moment of moral reckoning that would be remembered and discussed and analyzed for years to come. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to object or plead or demand, but no sound came out as she finally began to understand what was about to happen to her. Therefore, Elena announced, her voice carrying clearly to every seat on the aircraft, I am ordering the immediate removal of the passenger in seat 1B for violations of federal aviation regulations regarding discriminatory harassment and disruptive behavior. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth, please gather your belongings and accompany airport security off this aircraft. The sound that erupted from the cabin wasn't quite applause and wasn't quite cheering, but something between the two, a collective release of tension that had been building throughout the confrontation as passengers realized that justice was not only possible, but was actually happening before their eyes. Someone in economy class shouted, "Yes," and the exclamation was picked up by other voices throughout the aircraft, creating a wave of approval that validated Elena's decision and demonstrated that the vast majority of people present understood exactly what had just occurred and wholeheartedly supported it. Victoria stood frozen in the aisle, her brain apparently unable to process the fact that the rules she had assumed would protect her were the same rules that were now being used to remove her, that the authority she had appealed to had sided against her in the most public and humiliating way possible. "This is impossible," she whispered, though her voice carried clearly in the sudden quiet that followed the passenger's outburst. "You can't do this to me. I'm Victoria Ashworth. My husband built half of Manhattan. I know the CEO of this airline. Mrs. Ashworth. Elena replied, her voice now carrying a note of finality that made it clear the decision was not subject to appeal or negotiation. Federal aviation regulations don't make exceptions based on wealth or connections or personal relationships. They exist to protect all passengers equally, and that's exactly how they're going to be applied today. Airport security appeared at the aircraft door as if summoned by Elena's announcement, two uniformed officers who moved with the sort of professional efficiency that suggested they had handled similar situations before and understood exactly what was required. The lead officer, a woman in her 40s with the bearing of someone who had spent years dealing with every variety of human behavior, approached Victoria with polite but firm authority. "Mrs. Ashworth, I'm Officer Martinez with Port Authority Police. I need you to gather your personal items and come with us." Victoria looked around the cabin one more time, her eyes moving from face to face in search of sympathy or support, or at least understanding, but finding only the sort of cold disapproval usually reserved for people who had violated fundamental codes of human decency in the most public way possible. The reality of her situation finally began to penetrate the bubble of entitlement that had protected her from consequences for most of her adult life, and she understood that she was about to become the subject of exactly the sort of viral humiliation that she had spent her life believing happened only to other people. The removal of Victoria Ashworth from Flight 847 took exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds from the moment Officer Martinez placed her hand on Victoria's elbow to the moment the aircraft door closed behind the small procession that included Victoria, her former assistant Miranda, 2 security officers, and 3 shopping bags full of luxury items that would soon become evidence in a federal case about air rage and discriminatory harassment. But those 4 minutes and 37 seconds contained enough drama and revelation to fuel months of social media discussion, legal proceedings, and airline industry policy reviews, because every moment was being recorded by multiple passengers, whose phones captured not just Victoria's increasingly desperate protests, but also the reactions of everyone around her, creating a comprehensive record of a woman's complete moral collapse in real time. "This is a mistake," Victoria shouted, as Officer Martinez guided her toward the exit, her voice carrying the sort of desperate edge that comes from finally understanding that money and connections might not be enough to shield her from the consequences of her actions. "You're removing the wrong person. He's the one who doesn't belong here. I'm the victim in this situation." The irony of her words wasn't lost on the passengers who were documenting every moment, many of whom had started recording when Victoria first began her tirade, and were now sitting on what they understood would become one of the most viral videos of the year. Dr. Fisher watched her go, with the sort of sad expression that comes from having seen this particular form of human failing too many times before, while Malik remained in his seat with his hands still folded, unwilling to believe that the ordeal was actually over until the aircraft door closed and the engine started. Miranda Chen found herself in the impossible position of having to choose between following her employer off the aircraft or abandoning her job in one of the most public ways imaginable. But as she watched Victoria being escorted away while still screaming about lawsuits and connections, and the injustice of being held accountable for her actions, the choice became surprisingly clear, Ms. Ashworth, Miranda said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin as she set down the shopping bags she'd been carrying. "I resign. Effective immediately." The announcement drew a fresh round of applause from the passengers, who understood that they had just witnessed not just the removal of a disruptive passenger, but the liberation of a young woman who had finally found the courage to stand up to a boss whose behavior had probably been making her complicit in situations like this for years. Miranda walked back toward the gate agent with her head held high, leaving Victoria to face the consequences of her actions without the assistant who had been enabling them for far too long. As the aircraft door closed and the jet bridge retracted, Captain Elena Rodriguez returned to the cockpit with the sort of quiet satisfaction that comes from making a difficult decision and knowing it was absolutely the right one. Her co-pilot, First Officer David Chen, looked up from his pre-flight checklist with an expression of profound respect, mixed with slight concern about the potential ramifications of what had just occurred. "Captain, that was incredible," David said, his voice carrying genuine admiration for the moral courage Elena had just displayed. "But are you worried about the corporate response?" Removing a first-class passenger who paid $12,000 for her ticket, Elena settled into her captain's seat and began running through her own checklist, her movements precise and professional, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system from the confrontation. "David, in 15 years of flying, I've learned that there are two kinds of difficult situations. There are the ones where you have to choose between safety and convenience, and there are the ones where you have to choose between doing what's right and doing what's easy. This was definitely the second kind." She paused in her checklist to look out the cockpit window at the ground crew preparing for pushback, thinking about the young man in seat 1. A, who was probably still trying to process what had just happened to him, and the elderly gentleman in 2A whose testimony had provided crucial moral context for her decision, and the hundreds of other passengers who had just witnessed something that would restore at least some of their faith in the possibility that authority figures might occasionally use their power to protect people rather than profit. Besides, Elena continued with a slight smile, "Something tells me that corporate is going to be much more concerned about the legal and public relations nightmare that Mrs. Ashworth just created for herself than they are about losing one passenger whose behavior would have generated thousands of complaints and probably several lawsuits if we'd allowed it to continue." Back in the first-class cabin, James Parker was working to reset the atmosphere and restore some sense of normalcy to a section that had just been transformed into a battleground for competing visions of human dignity and social justice. He approached Malik's seat with the sort of gentle professionalism that comes from understanding that someone who has just been through a traumatic experience might need some time and space to process what happened. "Mr. Thompson," James said quietly, "I wanted to personally apologize for what you just experienced. That should never happen to anyone, and I want you to know that the entire crew is committed to making sure the rest of your flight is as comfortable and peaceful as possible." Malik looked up from his research materials, his eyes still showing the strain of the confrontation, but also a growing sense of relief as he began to understand that he was actually going to be allowed to remain in his seat to continue his journey to Geneva to present his research as planned. "Thank you, James. I appreciate that more than you know." Dr. Fischer leaned forward from his seat in 2A, his weathered face showing the sort of gentle concern that comes from having developed deep empathy through personal experience with persecution and prejudice. "Young man, are you all right? That was a terrible thing to endure, but you handled yourself with remarkable dignity throughout the entire ordeal." "I'm okay, Dr. Fischer," Malik replied, though his voice still carried a slight tremor that suggested he was still processing the emotional impact of being publicly attacked for the crime of existing in a space where someone else didn't think he belonged. "I just keep thinking about how different this could have gone if Captain Rodriguez hadn't been willing to do the right thing." The elderly gentleman nodded slowly, understanding exactly what Malik meant, because he had lived through historical periods when authority figures had made very different choices when faced with similar moments of moral decision. There are always people who will choose hatred over understanding, young man. But there are also always people who will choose justice over convenience, courage over comfort. Today we were fortunate to encounter the second kind. As Flight 847 pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, passengers throughout the aircraft were already uploading videos and posting updates about what they had just witnessed, creating the first ripples of what would soon become a massive wave of social media attention, news coverage, and public discussion about discrimination, privilege, and the responsibility that comes with authority. The hashtag justice. at 30,000 feet began trending within the first hour of takeoff as passengers shared their videos and their perspectives on a confrontation that seemed to crystallize so many of the tensions and contradictions that define modern air travel, modern society, and the ongoing struggle to create spaces where people can coexist with dignity, regardless of their background or the color of their skin. But perhaps the most significant ripple effect was the one that couldn't be measured in likes or shares or trending topics, the personal transformation happening in Seat 1. Where a young man who had boarded the aircraft believing he didn't quite belong anywhere, was beginning to understand that he belonged exactly where his talent and determination had placed him, and that there were people with the authority and the courage to protect that belonging when it was threatened by those who would prefer to see the world remain unchanged. As the aircraft climbed into the evening sky above San Francisco, carrying its passengers toward Geneva and toward whatever consequences would flow from the choices they had all made and witnessed, Malik Thompson opened his laptop and began reviewing his presentation one more time, but now with a different kind of confidence than he'd felt that morning. He was no longer the uncertain graduate student worried about whether he deserved his seat. He was a researcher with important work to share, traveling in a seat he had earned, protected by people who understood that justice was more important than convenience, and that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. Malik Thompson woke up in his Geneva hotel room to the sound of his phone buzzing with notifications that had been accumulating throughout the night. Like digital snow, each ping representing another comment share or news article about a flight that had taken off from San Francisco 18 hours earlier as a routine commercial journey, and had landed in Switzerland as the center of a global conversation about racism, privilege, and the power of ordinary people to stand up for what's right when authority figures choose courage over convenience. The first notification he saw was from his foster sister Zara, now recovering successfully from her surgery thanks to the fellowship money that had made this trip possible. Her text was characteristically direct. "Holy shit, Malik. You're all over the internet. Are you okay? Also, you're famous now, which is weird but also awesome. Call me when you wake up." The second notification was from Dr. Sarah Chen, who had called to inform him that the fellowship committee had already received 17 interview requests from major news outlets, 6 speaking invitations from other conferences, and 3 preliminary funding offers from aerospace companies that wanted to fast-track his research into commercial development. The third was from his graduate advisor at Stanford, who had forwarded him a message from the university president expressing full support for Malik and requesting a meeting to discuss expanded funding opportunities when he returned from Geneva. By the time Malik had scrolled through the first page of notifications, he understood that he had woken up in a fundamentally different world than the one he'd fallen asleep in, a world where his name was trending on social media alongside hashtags like #JusticeAt30,000 feet and #FlyingWhileBlack, where his research on sustainable aviation fuel was being discussed not just in academic circles but on morning television shows and news websites that reached millions of people who had never heard of algae bioengineering, but who understood injustice when they saw it. The video footage from Flight 847 had been edited and shared thousands of times, creating a narrative arc that compressed the entire confrontation into bite-sized segments that could be consumed and discussed across every social media platform simultaneously. The clip of Victoria screaming about "people like you" had been viewed over 2 million times, while Captain Elena Rodriguez's announcement about passenger removal had been turned into inspirational memes celebrating her courage and moral leadership. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in a Port Authority holding cell at JFK Airport, Victoria Ashworth was experiencing her own version of viral fame, though the experience was considerably less pleasant than Malik's. She had spent the night in a 6-by-8-foot room that smelled of disinfectant and despair, sharing space with 2 other women who had been arrested for various airport-related infractions and who had recognized her from the videos that were already circulating online by the time she was processed and booked. "Hey, you're the airplane racist lady. one of her cellmates had announced when Victoria was escorted in her Chanel suit, now wrinkled beyond recognition, and her platinum hair hanging limply around her face. "My cousin sent me the video. You really told that kid he didn't belong in first-class girl. That was some next-level Karen behavior right there." Victoria had spent the hours since her arrest alternating between rage and disbelief, unable to process the fact that she was the one facing criminal charges, when she had clearly been the victim of discrimination by an airline crew that had chosen to side with someone who obviously didn't deserve to be in first class over a paying customer whose family had been supporting the airline industry for decades through their business travel and corporate partnerships. Her phone calls to lawyers had been less productive than she'd hoped, with 3 different attorneys declining to take her case after reviewing the video footage that was already being analyzed on legal commentary shows as a textbook example of discrimination and harassment that would be almost impossible to defend in court. The 4th attorney she'd reached had been willing to represent her, but had warned that her best-case scenario involved pleading guilty to reduced charges and hoping the public attention would die down before she faced civil lawsuits from Malik and possibly other passengers who had been traumatized by her behavior. The media coverage of the incident was evolving in real time, with early reports focusing on the basic facts of what had happened, giving way to deeper investigations into Victoria's background and business practices. Investigative journalists had already discovered the price-hiking scandals at Ashworth Pharmaceuticals, the pattern of discrimination complaints from former employees, and the charitable foundation that had been paying for Victoria's lifestyle while contributing almost nothing to actual charitable causes. Ashworth Pharmaceuticals' stock price had dropped 12% in overnight trading with major investors, expressing concerns about the company's leadership and corporate culture in light of the video evidence of Victoria's behavior. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting for that afternoon, with multiple sources, suggesting that Victoria's removal as CEO was not a question of if but when. Dr. Abraham Fisher, meanwhile, was discovering that his impromptu testimony about recognizing hatred in all its forms had resonated with audiences far beyond the passengers on Flight 847. His words about ordinary people choosing courage were being quoted in editorials and social media posts, while Holocaust education organizations were reaching out to invite him to speak about the connections between historical persecution and contemporary discrimination. "I never expected that speaking up on an airplane would lead to this kind of attention, Doctor," Fisher told a reporter from CNN who had tracked him down at his Geneva hotel. "But perhaps that's the lesson here, that we never know when we'll be called upon to choose between silence and speaking truth to power. The important thing is that we're ready to make the right choice when that moment arrives." Captain Elena Rodriguez was fielding her own media requests, though she was handling them with the sort of professional restraint that came from understanding that she was now representing not just herself, but her airline and the broader aviation industry's response to discrimination. Her statement to the press was characteristically measured and focused on the regulations and procedures that had guided her decision, rather than the personal satisfaction she felt from seeing justice done. Federal aviation regulations are clear about passenger removal in cases of harassment and discriminatory behavior, Elena told reporters outside her crew hotel in Geneva. "My obligation as a pilot in command is to ensure the safety and dignity of all passengers regardless of their background or the price they paid for their ticket. That obligation doesn't change based on someone's wealth or social connections." The airline's corporate response had been swift and supportive, with executives understanding that Elena's decision had not only been legally correct, but had also generated exactly the kind of positive publicity that money couldn't buy. The company's stock price had actually increased as investors responded favorably to clear evidence that the airline would protect passengers from discrimination rather than prioritize revenue from problematic customers. Miranda Chen, Victoria's former assistant, found herself at the center of her own media story as journalists sought to understand the working conditions and corporate culture that had enabled Victoria's behavior for so many years. Her resignation on the aircraft had been captured on video and was being celebrated as an example of workplace courage. But Miranda was discovering that liberation from toxic employment came with its own complications. "I should have quit. Years ago," Miranda told a reporter from the Washington Post who had found her at a coffee shop near her Manhattan apartment. But when you're trapped in an abusive work environment, it becomes normalized in ways that you don't recognize until something like this happens, and you suddenly see clearly how wrong everything has been. The broader conversation sparked by Flight 847 was expanding beyond the specifics of what had happened to Victoria and Malik, evolving into a national discussion about discrimination in air travel corporate accountability for executive behavior and the responsibility of bystanders to intervene when they witness injustice. Airlines across the industry were reviewing their policies and training procedures, while business schools were already incorporating the incident into case studies about crisis management and ethical leadership. But perhaps the most significant media coverage focused on Malik himself and the research that had earned him his seat in first class in the first place. His work on sustainable aviation fuel was being featured in science magazines and environmental publications, with experts predicting that the attention generated by the discrimination incident would accelerate funding and development of technologies that could transform the aerospace industry's environmental impact. Sometimes injustice can create unexpected opportunities for justice, Malik told a reporter from Scientific American as he prepared for his presentation at the Global Innovation Summit. "If the attention from what happened on that flight helps my research reach people who can implement these technologies on a larger scale, then maybe something positive can come from something that started so negatively." As Malik prepared for the most important presentation of his career, now scheduled for a much larger auditorium due to increased interest from conference attendees who wanted to hear from the young scientist who had become an overnight symbol of perseverance and dignity. Under pressure, he reflected on how quickly everything had changed. 24 hours earlier, he had been an unknown graduate student, worried about whether he deserved his seat. Now he was the face of a movement carrying not just his own dreams, but the hopes of everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong somewhere they had earned the right to be. The FBI field office in Queens received the case file on Victoria Ashworth at 8:47 a.m. Eastern Time, exactly 18 hours after Flight 847 had departed San Francisco International Airport. Though the federal investigation had technically begun the moment Officer Martinez placed handcuffs on Victoria's wrists for assault on a law enforcement officer and interference with a flight crew, charges that automatically triggered federal jurisdiction and the possibility of significant prison time. Special Agent Maria Santos had been investigating aviation-related crimes for 8 years, had handled everything from terrorism threats to smuggling operations to drunk passengers who had tried to open emergency exits mid-flight, but she had never encountered a case where the evidence was quite so comprehensive or the defendant quite so obviously guilty of everything she was accused of doing. The video footage from multiple passengers created a complete record of Victoria's behavior, while witness statements from Dr. Fisher, Captain Rodriguez, and other passengers corroborated every detail of the harassment and discrimination that had led to her removal. "This is the easiest case I've ever been assigned," Agent Santos told her supervisor after reviewing the initial evidence package. "We have multiple videos, dozens of witnesses, federal aviation violations, assault charges, and a defendant who was recorded making explicitly racist statements in front of 300 people. The only challenge is going to be deciding which charges to prioritize." The federal prosecutor assigned to the case, Assistant U.S. Attorney David Kim, was equally struck by the strength of the evidence and the clarity of Victoria's violations of federal law. His office handled hundreds of cases each year, involving everything from financial fraud to organized crime. But Victoria's behavior on Flight 847 represented such a clear-cut example of criminal conduct that he was already preparing for a quick guilty plea rather than a protracted trial. The interesting legal question isn't whether she violated federal regulations, Prosecutor Kim explained to his staff during their daily case review meeting. The interesting question is whether this incident represents a pattern of discriminatory behavior that might constitute civil rights violations under federal hate crime statutes. If we can establish that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of targeting people based on race, we could be looking at significantly enhanced penalties. That investigation began with Miranda Chen, whose decision to resign from her position as Victoria's assistant had made her the most valuable potential witness in establishing whether Victoria's behavior on Flight 847 was an aberration, or simply the most public example of conduct that had been ongoing for years. Miranda met with federal investigators in a conference room at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared to detail years of experiences that she had previously kept confidential out of professional obligation and personal fear. Mrs. Ashworth made discriminatory comments about employees and customers on a regular basis. Miranda told Agent Santos, her voice growing stronger, as she realized that her testimony might prevent other people from experiencing what Malik had endured. She would refuse to work with vendors owned by minorities, would make derogatory comments about the race or ethnicity of restaurant servers and hotel staff, and would often demand to be seated away from passengers she deemed inappropriate during business travel. Miranda's testimony was corroborated by other former employees of Ashworth Pharmaceuticals who came forward after seeing the news coverage of Victoria's arrest. The company's Human Resources Department had received 17 discrimination complaints about Victoria over the past 5 years, though most had been quietly settled with non-disclosure agreements that prevented the victims from speaking publicly about their experiences. Dr. Abraham Fisher's role in the investigation was more complex but equally crucial, as federal prosecutors understood that his testimony would carry enormous weight with any potential jury. His experience as a Holocaust survivor gave his words about recognizing hatred a moral authority that would be impossible to challenge, while his calm and dignified demeanor during the flight confrontation had been captured on video and would demonstrate to jurors exactly what kind of witness they were hearing from. "I have seen what happens when good people remain silent in the face of hatred," Dr. Fisher told prosecutors during his interview at the federal building in Manhattan. "I have lived through the consequences of societies that allow prejudice to flourish without intervention. What Mrs. Ashworth did on that airplane was not just an attack on one young man, it was an attack on the principle that all people deserve to be treated with dignity, regardless of their background." Captain Elena Rodriguez faced her own investigation, though hers was conducted by the airline's Internal Affairs Department and the Federal Aviation Administration to determine whether her decision to remove Victoria had been legally justified and procedurally correct. The review was completed within 72 hours, with investigators concluding that Elena had not only acted within her authority, but had demonstrated exactly the kind of moral leadership that the aviation industry needed to maintain public trust and passenger safety. Captain Rodriguez's decision to remove Mrs. Ashworth was not only legally justified, but morally imperative, the FAA's report concluded. Her actions demonstrate that federal aviation regulations protecting passengers from discrimination and harassment will be enforced regardless of the economic status or social connections of the violating passenger. The civil lawsuit filed by Malik's legal team moved forward on a parallel track to the federal criminal case, with attorneys Arthur Pendleton and Sarah Williams, who had flown in from London and Atlanta respectively to represent Malik pro bono, building a comprehensive case for damages that would address not just the immediate trauma of the discrimination incident, but the broader impact on Malik's reputation, emotional well-being, and future opportunities. "This case is about more than monetary compensation," Arthur Pendleton explained to reporters outside the federal courthouse in Manhattan. "This case is about establishing clear legal precedent that passengers cannot be subjected to racial harassment without facing meaningful consequences, and that airlines have an obligation to protect all passengers from discrimination, regardless of who is buying the tickets. The investigation also revealed the broader pattern of corporate malfeasance at Ashworth Pharmaceuticals, where Victoria's personal prejudices had influenced hiring practices, vendor selection, and customer service policies in ways that had created a hostile work environment and potentially discriminatory business practices. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened its own investigation into whether the company had disclosed material information about executive behavior that might affect stock performance, while the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission began reviewing discrimination complaints that had been settled privately over the past decade. Victoria's legal defense team, led by attorney Robert Sterling, faced the impossible task of representing a client whose criminal behavior had been recorded from multiple angles and whose racist statements had been broadcast to millions of people through social media and news coverage. Their strategy focused on portraying Victoria as someone whose mental health had been compromised by grief over her husband's death and stress from managing a complex business empire. Though this approach was complicated by evidence that her discriminatory behavior predated both her widowhood and her business responsibilities. Mrs. Ashworth deeply regrets the incident on Flight 847 and understands that her behavior was inappropriate and hurtful, Sterling said in a prepared statement that carefully avoided admitting to any specific criminal charges. She is committed to making amends for her actions and participating in any court-ordered counseling or community service that might help her understand the impact of her behavior on others. The federal investigation also examined the role of other passengers who had witnessed the discrimination but had initially remained silent, raising broader questions about the responsibility of bystanders to intervene when they see injustice occurring. While no charges were filed against other passengers, the incident sparked national conversations about the moral obligation to speak up when witnessing discrimination, and the courage required to challenge authority figures who enable or ignore prejudice. What happened on Flight 847 reminds us that injustice thrives when good people remain silent, said Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a civil rights attorney and professor at Columbia Law School, who had been following the case closely. Dr. Fisher's decision to speak up. Captain Rodriguez's decision to act on her moral convictions, and Miranda Chen's decision to resign rather than continue enabling discriminatory behavior. These are examples of the kind of moral courage that we need to see more often in our society. As the investigation continued and the legal proceedings moved forward, the broader implications of Flight 847 were becoming clear to everyone involved. This wasn't just a case about one woman's racist behavior or one man's experience with discrimination. It was a test of whether American institutions, the legal system, corporate governance, the aviation industry, and society at large, were truly committed to the principles of equality and justice that they claimed to uphold, or whether those principles were simply rhetorical flourishes that would be abandoned when they conflicted with profit margins and social convenience. The federal courthouse in Manhattan had seen its share of high-profile trials, had hosted cases involving organized crime bosses and international terrorists and corporate executives whose financial crimes had destroyed thousands of lives, but rarely had a case generated the kind of sustained public interest that accompanied the prosecution of Victoria Ashworth for her behavior on Flight 847, a trial that had become a symbol of whether America's legal system would hold privileged individuals accountable for discriminatory behavior or continue to treat such conduct as a minor social inconvenience rather than a serious crime. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Kim stood before a jury of 12 citizens who had been selected through an exhaustive process designed to identify individuals who could fairly evaluate evidence about racial discrimination without being unduly influenced by either the extensive media coverage of Victoria's behavior or their own personal experiences with prejudice and privilege. The prosecution's opening statement was straightforward and devastating, outlining a pattern of criminal conduct that was supported by video evidence, witness testimony, and Victoria's own recorded statements. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Prosecutor Kim began, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority that comes from representing not just the federal government, but the broader principle that no one is above the law. regardless of their wealth or social status. We are here today because the defendant, Victoria Ashworth, made a series of choices that violated federal law, violated the civil rights of a fellow American citizen, and violated the basic standards of human decency that make civilized society possible. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive, beginning with Malik Thompson's testimony about his experience on Flight 847. Malik took the witness stand wearing a navy blue suit that fit him perfectly. A far cry from the borrowed blazer he'd worn on the flight, his voice steady and dignified as he recounted the details of Victoria's harassment with the sort of precise recall that comes from having relived the experience countless times in interviews and depositions. She looked at me like I was something that had no right to exist in the same space she occupied. Malik testified, his words carrying clearly through the packed courtroom where journalists and civil rights activists had gathered to witness what many considered a landmark case about discrimination and accountability. She didn't see a researcher, didn't see a graduate student, didn't see a human being with feelings and dignity. She saw someone whose presence in first class challenged her assumptions about who deserves what in this world, and she decided that the appropriate response was to try to humiliate me into leaving. Dr. Abraham Fisher's testimony provided crucial historical context for Victoria's behavior, with the elderly Holocaust survivor drawing parallels between the discrimination he had witnessed during World War II and the hatred he had seen on Flight 847. His words carried the moral weight of lived experience with persecution, making it impossible for jurors to dismiss Victoria's behavior as a minor social transgression, rather than part of a broader pattern of prejudice that had caused immeasurable harm throughout human history. I have seen what happens when societies allow hatred to flourish unchallenged. Dr. Fisher told the jury, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. I have lived through the consequences of people believing that some human beings are less worthy of dignity and respect than others. What Mrs. Ashworth did on that airplane was not an isolated incident of bad behavior. It was an expression of the same fundamental hatred that has caused suffering throughout history. Captain Elena Rodriguez testified about her decision-making process during the incident, explaining how federal aviation regulations and her own moral convictions had led her to remove Victoria from the aircraft. Her testimony demonstrated that Victoria's removal had not been an impulsive decision based on personal bias, but a carefully considered response to criminal behavior that posed a threat to passenger safety and violated federal law. My responsibility as pilot in command extends beyond mechanical safety, Elena explained to the jury, her uniform crisp and her bearing professional as she detailed the regulations and procedures that had guided her actions. I have an obligation to ensure that all passengers can travel with dignity and security regardless of their race, their background, or their economic status. Mrs. Ashworth's behavior created a hostile environment that threatened the safety and well-being of other passengers, and federal law required her removal. Miranda Chen's testimony proved particularly damaging to Victoria's defense, as the former assistant detailed years of discriminatory behavior that established a clear pattern of prejudice rather than an isolated incident of poor judgment. Miranda's decision to resign during the flight had been captured on video, providing dramatic evidence of the impact that Victoria's behavior had on the people around her. Mrs. Ashworth regularly made derogatory comments about people based on their race and ethnicity. Miranda testified, her voice growing stronger as she detailed experiences that she had kept confidential for years out of professional obligation and personal fear. She would refuse to work with minority-owned businesses, would demand to be seated away from passengers she deemed inappropriate during business travel, and would often make racist jokes that she expected me to laugh at as part of my job responsibilities. The defense's case, led by attorney Robert Sterling, attempted to portray Victoria as someone whose behavior had been influenced by grief over her husband's death and stress from managing a complex business empire, but this strategy was severely undermined by evidence that her discriminatory conduct predated both her widowhood and her business responsibilities. Sterling's attempts to characterize Victoria's statements as misunderstandings rather than deliberate harassment were contradicted by the video evidence and witness testimony that demonstrated clear intent to intimidate and humiliate Malik based on his race, Mrs. Ashworth is not a racist, Sterling argued during his closing statement, though his words rang hollow in the face of recorded evidence showing Victoria making explicitly discriminatory statements to multiple witnesses. She is a grieving widow who made poor choices under stress, and while her behavior was inappropriate, it does not rise to the level of federal criminal conduct. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: interference with flight crew members, assault on a federal officer, and civil rights violations based on racial discrimination. The speed of their deliberation suggested that Victoria's conduct had been so clearly criminal that little discussion was required to reach unanimous agreement about her guilt. Judge Patricia Williams, a veteran federal judge who had presided over numerous civil rights cases during her 20-year career on the bench, delivered Victoria's sentence with the sort of measured authority that reflected both the seriousness of her crimes and the broader social implications of holding privileged individuals accountable for discriminatory behavior. Mrs. Ashworth, your behavior on Flight 847 represents more than just a violation of federal aviation regulations, Judge Williams said, as Victoria stood before the bench with her hands clasped in front of her, her platinum hair now showing gray roots, and her expensive clothes replaced by the orange jumpsuit she had worn during her pretrial detention. Your conduct represents an attack on the fundamental principle that all Americans deserve to be treated with dignity regardless of their race or background. The court sentences you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation and 500 hours of community service focused on civil rights education. The civil lawsuit filed by Malik's legal team was resolved through a settlement that awarded him $4.2 million in damages for emotional distress, reputational harm, and the violation of his civil rights money that would fund not only his continued education, but also a scholarship foundation designed to help other students from disadvantaged backgrounds pursue careers in science and engineering. Victoria's personal assets, including her Manhattan penthouse and Hampton estate, were liquidated to pay the settlement and her legal fees, leaving her with barely enough money to rent a modest apartment after her release from prison. The broader consequences of Victoria's conviction extended far beyond her personal punishment, creating ripple effects throughout the business world and the aviation industry. Ashworth Pharmaceuticals' board of directors had voted unanimously to remove her as CEO, while the Securities and Exchange Commission imposed substantial fines on the company for failing to disclose information about executive behavior that could affect stock performance. The airline industry implemented new training protocols for dealing with discriminatory passenger behavior, while business schools began incorporating the case into their curricula as an example of how personal prejudice can destroy corporate value and executive careers. Dr. Fisher used the attention generated by his testimony to launch a speaking tour focused on the connections between historical persecution and contemporary discrimination, visiting universities and community organizations to share his insights about the importance of speaking up when witnessing injustice. His partnership with Malik to establish educational programs about civil rights and Holocaust history created a powerful intergenerational dialogue about the ongoing struggle for human dignity and equality. Captain Elena Rodriguez was promoted to chief pilot and became the face of her airline's commitment to protecting passengers from discrimination, while her decision to remove Victoria was studied in aviation management programs as an example of moral leadership under pressure. James Parker, the flight attendant who had initially tried to de-escalate the situation, was promoted to training supervisor and developed new protocols for crew members dealing with discriminatory passenger behavior. Miranda Chen used her experience working for Victoria to launch a nonprofit organization focused on supporting employees who face discrimination and harassment in the workplace, providing legal resources and emotional support for people who need courage to speak up against powerful employers who abuse their authority. Her resignation on Flight 847 became a symbol of workplace liberation, inspiring other employees to leave toxic situations and seek better opportunities. But perhaps the most significant transformation occurred in Malik Thompson himself, who used the platform created by his experience on Flight 847 to become a powerful advocate for diversity in science and engineering fields. His research on sustainable aviation fuel accelerated by funding opportunities that emerged from the media attention surrounding the discrimination incident led to breakthrough developments that promised to revolutionize the environmental impact of air travel while creating new opportunities for scientists from underrepresented backgrounds. 6 months after Victoria Ashworth began serving her federal prison sentence in a minimum security facility outside Albany, New York, Malik Thompson stood before a crowd of 300 people gathered in the auditorium of the Oakland Community Center, where he had once attended after-school programs as a foster child, bouncing between placements and struggling to believe that someone like him could ever amount to anything significant in a world that seemed designed to keep people like him in their assigned places. The auditorium was packed with local families, educational administrators, aerospace industry executives, and journalists who had come to witness the launch of the Thompson-Fischer Foundation for Educational Excellence, a scholarship and mentorship program funded by the settlement from Malik's civil lawsuit against Victoria and designed to provide opportunities for foster children and other underrepresented students to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields that had historically excluded people who looked like them. When I was growing up in this community, bouncing from house to house and school to school, I used to sit in this very auditorium, watching other people receive awards and recognition for achievements that seemed completely out of reach for someone with my background. Malik told the crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the space where he had once felt invisible and unwanted. I never imagined that someday I would be standing here with the opportunity to create pathways for other young people who have been told they don't belong in certain spaces or don't deserve certain opportunities. The Foundation's inaugural scholarship class included 25 students from foster care backgrounds across California, each receiving full funding for undergraduate education, plus mentorship internship opportunities and research funding for projects addressing real-world problems in their communities. The selection process had prioritized not just academic achievement, but also resilience, creativity, and the sort of innovative thinking that comes from having to solve problems without access to traditional resources or support systems. Dr. Abraham Fisher, now 81, but still sharp and energetic, despite his age, served as co-founder and chairman of the Foundation's advisory board, bringing his perspective as a Holocaust survivor and human rights advocate to the organization's mission of creating opportunities for young people who faced discrimination and systematic exclusion from educational advancement. His partnership with Malik had evolved into a deep friendship based on their shared understanding of how prejudice operates and their commitment to transforming suffering into service for others. Education has always been both the target of those who seek to oppress and the weapon of those who refuse to be oppressed. Dr. Fisher told the audience his words carrying the weight of 8 decades of experience with both the worst and best aspects of human nature. By providing these young people with the tools and opportunities to pursue excellence in fields that will shape our future, we are not just changing their individual lives, we are strengthening the foundation of our entire society. Zara Thompson, now a high school senior who had recovered completely from her surgery and was planning to study biomedical engineering at MIT in the fall, served as the Foundation's first student ambassador, speaking about her brother's journey from foster care to academic success, and her own determination to follow a similar path in using education as a tool for social change and community improvement. My brother taught me that success isn't just about what you achieve for yourself, It's about what opportunities you create for other people who are facing the same challenges you once faced. Zara said her voice carrying the confidence and determination that had helped her excel academically, despite the disruptions and uncertainties of growing up in the foster care system. This foundation represents the possibility that one person's experience with injustice can become the foundation for justice for many other people. The scholarship recipients themselves represented the diversity and potential that the foundation was designed to serve. Maria Santos, a 17-year-old foster child from East Los Angeles, who had designed water purification systems for use in disaster relief. Kevin Johnson, an 18-year-old from Detroit who had developed apps to help other foster children navigate the transition to independent living. Amara Patel, a 16-year-old refugee from Somalia, who had created educational robots to teach science concepts to younger children who spoke limited English. Each scholarship included not just tuition funding, but also mentorship from successful professionals in their chosen fields, internship opportunities at leading technology companies and research institutions, and ongoing support from social workers and counselors who understood the unique challenges faced by young people aging out of foster care or dealing with other forms of family disruption and instability. Captain Elena Rodriguez attended the foundation launch in her capacity as a board member and keynote speaker, having become a close friend and mentor to Malik during the months following the Flight 847 incident. Her presentation focused on the importance of moral courage in professional settings and the responsibility that people in authority positions have to use their power to protect those who are vulnerable to discrimination and abuse. The decision I made on Flight 847 wasn't just about following federal regulations or maintaining order on my aircraft, Elena told the scholarship recipients during a private mentorship session before the public ceremony. It was about understanding that my authority as captain came with the responsibility to protect every passenger's dignity and safety, regardless of their background or the price they paid for their ticket. Each of you will face similar moments in your careers when you'll have to choose between doing what's convenient and doing what's right. The Foundation's headquarters, located in a renovated warehouse in Oakland's Fruitvale district, included not just administrative offices, but also a fully equipped makerspace where scholarship recipients could work on research projects, a computer lab with the latest software and hardware for engineering and scientific work, and a library stocked with technical journals and books that many of these students had never had access to during their educational careers. Miranda Chen, Victoria's former assistant who had transformed her experience with workplace harassment into a successful career as an advocate for employee rights and corporate accountability, served on the Foundation's board and spoke about the importance of creating supportive environments where young people could develop their talents without facing the discrimination and hostility that had characterized too much of the American educational and professional experience. These students represent more than just individual success stories, Miranda told the audience. They represent our society's commitment to ensuring that talent and determination are rewarded, regardless of someone's background or the circumstances of their birth. The Foundation's mission is to prove that when we remove barriers and provide opportunities, young people from all backgrounds can achieve extraordinary things. The launch ceremony concluded with the announcement of the Foundation's first major research initiative, a partnership with NASA and SpaceX to develop sustainable space exploration technologies, with scholarship recipients working alongside leading aerospace engineers on projects that could revolutionize everything from rocket fuel to life support systems for long-duration space missions. As the audience applauded and the scholarship recipients posed for photographs with their mentors and supporters, Malik reflected on how completely his life had changed since that morning 6 months earlier, when he had sat in his cramped Oakland apartment wondering whether he would be able to continue his education or help his sister with her medical bills. The discrimination he had experienced on Flight 847 had been transformed into an opportunity to create lasting change for other young people who faced similar challenges and barriers. 1 year after Flight 847 landed in Geneva and transformed a routine business trip into a global conversation about racism, privilege and the power of ordinary people to stand up for justice when institutional authority chooses courage over convenience. Malik Thompson found himself standing in the General Assembly Hall of the United Nations headquarters in New York City, preparing to deliver a speech about sustainable technology and social justice to an audience of world leaders, diplomats, and international development experts who had gathered to discuss the intersection of environmental protection and human rights. The invitation to address the UN had come through Dr. Fisher's connections in the international human rights community, but Malik's presence at the podium represented something more significant than diplomatic courtesy or symbolic representation. His research on algae-based sustainable aviation fuel had advanced rapidly during the year since the Flight 847 incident, accelerated by funding opportunities and research partnerships that had emerged from the global attention surrounding his experience with discrimination, and his work was now being implemented in pilot programs by 3 major airlines and 2 aerospace companies. When I was a child aging out of the foster care system, moving from placement to placement and school to school, I never imagined that someday I would have the opportunity to address the world's leaders about the relationship between environmental sustainability and social justice. Malik began, his voice carrying clearly through the assembly hall where representatives from 193 nations had gathered to hear his presentation. But my journey from an uncertain teenager to someone whose work might help reduce global carbon emissions by millions of tons annually illustrates something important about the untapped human potential that exists in communities that have been marginalized and excluded from traditional pathways to achievement. His speech focused not just on the technical aspects of sustainable aviation technology, but on the broader implications of ensuring that scientific research and environmental protection efforts included diverse voices and perspectives from communities that would be most affected by both climate change and the economic transitions required to address it. The thunderous applause that followed his presentation reflected not just appreciation for his scientific work, but recognition of the symbolic importance of his presence at the UN podium as a representative of the possibility that talent and determination could overcome even the most entrenched forms of prejudice and exclusion. Dr. Fisher watched from the gallery with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, understanding that Malik's speech represented the fulfillment of everything he had hoped to achieve when he spoke up on Flight 847 about the importance of recognizing and challenging hatred in all its forms. At 81, the elderly Holocaust survivor had become a regular speaker at universities and community organizations across the country, sharing his insights about the connections between historical persecution and contemporary discrimination, while helping to establish educational programs that would teach future generations about the importance of moral courage and civic responsibility. Today, we witnessed something remarkable. Dr. Fisher told reporters outside the UN building after Malik's speech concluded. We saw a young man whose potential was nearly destroyed by prejudice and ignorance transformed into someone whose work will benefit all of humanity. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because people chose to stand up for what was right when they were faced with injustice, because institutions chose to support talent and character rather than privilege and connections. Captain Elena Rodriguez had been promoted to chief pilot and director of diversity and inclusion for her airline, where she was implementing training programs that would ensure flight crews across the industry were prepared to handle discriminatory passenger behavior with the same combination of professional competence and moral courage that she had demonstrated on Flight 847. Her decision to remove Victoria Ashworth had become a case study taught in business schools and aviation management programs as an example of how authority figures could use their power to protect vulnerable individuals while upholding institutional values and legal obligations. The aviation industry has learned important lessons from what happened on Flight 847. Elena explained during a panel discussion at the International Aviation Safety Conference, where her presentation about passenger discrimination and crew response protocols had drawn standing ovations from industry professionals around the world. We've learned that maintaining safety and order on aircraft requires not just attention to mechanical systems and weather conditions, but also vigilance about protecting every passenger's right to travel with dignity and respect regardless of their background or appearance. The Thompson-Fischer Foundation had grown from its initial class of 25 scholarship recipients to a nationwide program serving over 500 students across 15 states, with partnerships at major universities and technology companies that provided internships, research opportunities, and career placement for young people from foster care backgrounds and other underrepresented communities. The Foundation's success had inspired similar programs at other institutions, creating a network of educational initiatives designed to identify and develop talent that had previously been overlooked by traditional academic and professional systems. Miranda Chen's nonprofit organization, the Workplace Justice Alliance, had become a national leader in supporting employees who faced discrimination and harassment, providing legal resources, emotional support, and advocacy for people who needed courage to speak up against powerful employers who abused their authority. Her resignation on Flight 847 had become a symbol of workplace liberation, inspiring thousands of other employees to leave toxic situations and seek better opportunities while holding their former employers accountable for creating hostile work environments. The courage to speak up against injustice often requires significant personal sacrifice. Miranda told an audience of human resources professionals and employment lawyers during a conference about preventing workplace discrimination. But the alternative, remaining silent while abuse continues, ultimately costs our society much more than the temporary discomfort of confronting powerful people who believe their status exempts them from basic standards of human decency. James Parker, the flight attendant who had initially tried to de-escalate the situation between Victoria and Malik, had been promoted to training supervisor and was leading the development of new protocols for airline crew members dealing with discriminatory passenger behavior. His experience on Flight 847 had taught him that customer service sometimes required choosing between appeasing difficult customers and protecting vulnerable passengers, and his training programs emphasized the legal and moral obligations that crew members had to ensure all passengers could travel safely and comfortably. Victoria Ashworth, meanwhile, was serving the final months of her 18-month federal prison sentence in a minimum security facility where she was required to participate in counseling programs about racism and cultural sensitivity while performing community service focused on civil rights education. Her transformation during incarceration had been minimal, with prison counselors reporting that she continued to blame others for her situation and showed little genuine understanding of the harm her behavior had caused to Malik and other victims of her discrimination over the years. The pharmaceutical company that bore her family name had been sold to a larger corporation after the board of directors determined that the reputational damage from Victoria's conviction made it impossible to maintain investor confidence and regulatory approval for their drug development programs. The sale proceeds were used to settle multiple discrimination lawsuits filed by former employees and to establish a charitable foundation focused on making prescription medications more affordable for low-income patients, a mission that directly contradicted the price-hiking strategies that had made Victoria wealthy during her tenure as CEO. The broader impact of Flight 847 extended far beyond the individual lives that had been directly affected by the incident, influencing policy discussions about discrimination in transportation corporate governance reforms designed to hold executives accountable for personal behavior that affects their companies, and educational initiatives aimed at teaching young people about the importance of moral courage and civic responsibility in preventing injustice and promoting equality. The hashtag justice at 30,000 feet continued to trend periodically as social media users shared stories about their own experiences with discrimination and their efforts to speak up when they witnessed unfair treatment of others. The incident had become a reference point for discussions about privilege accountability and the responsibility that individuals with authority have to use their power to protect rather than exploit the people around them. Legal scholars and civil rights advocates pointed to Victoria's conviction as an important precedent for holding wealthy individuals accountable for discriminatory behavior, while the substantial financial settlement awarded to Malik demonstrated that victims of racism could seek meaningful compensation for the emotional and professional damage caused by such treatment. The case had strengthened legal protections for airline passengers and created new precedents for corporate liability when executive behavior violated civil rights laws. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Flight 847 was the inspiration it provided to countless individuals who had previously felt powerless to challenge discrimination and injustice in their own lives and communities. Dr. Fisher's decision to speak up. Elena Rodriguez's decision to act on her moral convictions. Miranda Chen's decision to resign rather than continue enabling abuse, and Malik's decision to transform his painful experience into opportunities for others, had created a template for moral courage that people could follow when they faced their own moments of choice between silence and speaking truth to power. The story of Flight 847 was being taught in schools and universities as an example of how individual actions could create broader social change, how personal courage could challenge institutional inequities, and how the decision to stand up for what was right could transform not just the immediate situation, but the larger systems and structures that perpetuated discrimination and exclusion. Students were learning that ordinary people in everyday situations had the power to choose justice over convenience, courage over comfort, and that those choices could ripple outward to create lasting change for future generations. As Malik prepared to board another aircraft for his return flight to California, where he would continue his research and his foundation work while completing his PhD at Stanford, he reflected on how completely his relationship with air travel had been transformed by the events of that evening a year earlier. What had once been a source of anxiety and uncertainty had become a symbol of possibility and achievement, a reminder that barriers could be overcome and that justice was possible when people with authority chose to use their power responsibly. 2 years to the day after Flight 847 departed San Francisco International Airport and transformed a routine business trip into a defining moment about dignity, justice, and the power of ordinary people to choose courage over convenience. Malik Thompson found himself walking through the same terminal past the same gates and shops and restaurants where he had once felt like an imposter trying to navigate a world that wasn't designed for someone with his background, but this time carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that belonging isn't granted by others, but claimed through character and earned through perseverance. The invitation to return to Geneva had come from the World Economic Forum, where Malik was scheduled to deliver the keynote address about sustainable technology and social innovation to an audience of world leaders, corporate executives and policymakers who would be making decisions about global environmental strategies and economic development programs that could affect billions of lives. His research on algae-based aviation fuel had progressed beyond pilot programs to commercial implementation, with 3 major airlines now using his technology to reduce their carbon emissions by 35%, while maintaining cost-effectiveness and operational efficiency. But this trip represented more than just professional recognition or scientific achievement. It represented the completion of a journey that had begun with humiliation and uncertainty, and had somehow transformed into purpose and possibility, proving that individual moments of injustice could become foundations for lasting social change, when the right people chose to respond with moral courage rather than comfortable indifference. Captain Elena Rodriguez was piloting the flight, a scheduling coincidence that felt more like destiny than chance, her presence in the cockpit serving as a reminder that some authority figures use their power to protect, rather than privilege to serve justice, rather than profit to defend dignity, rather than convenience. She had been promoted twice since the Flight 847 incident, and now served as Vice President of Safety and Inclusion for the airline, where her leadership had transformed industry standards for dealing with discriminatory passenger behavior and created new protocols that prioritized passenger welfare over customer appeasement. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Thompson." Elena said as she emerged from the cockpit during boarding to personally greet the passenger whose experience had catalyzed her own career transformation and whose courage under pressure had inspired her to become a more effective advocate for equality and justice in the aviation industry. It's an honor to have you flying with us again, and an even greater honor to share this journey with someone who has taught our industry so much about the importance of treating every passenger with the dignity and respect they deserve. Malik took his seat in 1A, the same seat where he had experienced both the worst and best of human nature during his previous flight to Geneva, though this time he was accompanied by Dr. Abraham Fisher, whose health had begun to decline, but whose spirit remained undiminished, and whose commitment to fighting prejudice and promoting understanding continued to inspire people around the world. At 83, the elderly Holocaust survivor moved more slowly than he once had, but his mind remained sharp and his moral clarity continued to serve as a North Star for people seeking guidance about how to respond to hatred and discrimination with wisdom and courage. "It feels different this time, doesn't it?" Dr. Fisher asked as he settled into seat 1B, his voice carrying the gentle warmth that had made him such an effective teacher and mentor during the 2 years since Flight 847 had brought them together in circumstances neither could have anticipated. "The same seats, the same destination, but we are not the same people we were when we first met on this route." The first-class cabin filled with passengers who represented the global community that Malik now served through his research and advocacy work. Environmental scientists traveling to present their own research business leaders implementing sustainable technologies in their industries. Policymakers working to address climate change through international cooperation, educators developing curricula that would teach future generations about the intersection of environmental protection and social justice. James Parker, now senior flight director and head of the airline's customer service training program, made his way through the cabin with the sort of professional grace that comes from years of experience managing every conceivable form of human behavior while maintaining his commitment to treating every passenger with equal respect and consideration, regardless of their background or the price they had paid for their ticket. "Dr. Fisher, Mr. Thompson," James said as he approached their seats, his smile carrying genuine warmth as he greeted 2 passengers who had become symbols of moral courage and resilience within the airline industry. "It's wonderful to have you both traveling with us again. I wanted you to know that the crew has been briefed about your presence on board, not because you require any special attention, but because your example has become part of our training program about responding to discrimination with professionalism and principle." As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Malik reflected on how completely his relationship with air travel had been transformed by the events that had occurred in this same space 24 months earlier. What had once been a source of anxiety and self-doubt had become an opportunity to appreciate how far he had traveled both literally and metaphorically from the uncertain graduate student who had worried about whether he deserved his seat to the confident scientist and advocate who now used his platform to create opportunities for other young people facing similar challenges and barriers. The flight to Geneva was peaceful and uneventful, filled with quiet conversations about research projects and policy initiatives, professional networking that would lead to future collaborations, and the sort of productive work that happens when air travel functions as it was designed to function as a safe and dignified transportation system that enables people from different backgrounds and locations to come together for purposes that serve the common good rather than personal prejudice. Halfway across the Atlantic, as the aircraft cruised through clear skies at 39,000 feet, Captain Rodriguez made an announcement over the public address system that surprised many passengers, but felt perfectly natural to those who understood the significance of this particular flight and these particular passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez speaking." Elena's voice carried through the cabin with the same calm authority she had demonstrated during the crisis on Flight 847, though this time her words carried celebration rather than confrontation, hope rather than correction. "We have the privilege today of carrying Dr. Abraham Fisher and Mr. Malik Thompson, whose courage and dignity during a difficult situation 2 years ago helped our airline and our industry learn important lessons about treating all passengers with respect and protecting everyone's right to travel safely and comfortably. The applause that followed Elena's announcement was spontaneous and sustained, with passengers throughout the aircraft expressing their appreciation for two individuals whose response to discrimination had created positive changes that extended far beyond their personal experiences. Dr. Fisher acknowledged the recognition with his characteristic humility, while Malik found himself moved by the realization that his painful experience had somehow been transformed into something that brought out the best rather than the worst in the people around him. "You know," Dr. Fisher said quietly as the applause subsided and normal cabin activity resumed, "I have often wondered whether the young woman who caused so much trouble on our previous flight ever understood the gift she gave to the world by revealing so clearly the difference between hatred and dignity, between privilege and character, between using power to harm others and using power to help them." Malik considered the question as he looked out the window at the vast expanse of ocean below, thinking about Victoria Ashworth, who had completed her prison sentence and was now working at a community health clinic in Montana, far from the world of wealth and privilege that had once insulated her from the consequences of her actions. Reports from her probation officer suggested that her transformation had been minimal, that she continued to blame others for her situation, rather than accepting responsibility for the choices that had led to her downfall. "I hope she finds peace eventually," Malik replied, his voice carrying the sort of compassion that comes from having moved beyond anger to understanding, from seeking revenge to pursuing justice, from being a victim of discrimination to becoming a champion of equality. "But whether she does or doesn't, I'm grateful that her actions led to so many positive changes for other people who might have faced similar treatment if no one had been willing to speak up and demand better." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Williams, Malik's fiancée and research partner, who had been working in the premium economy section where she was more comfortable, but who had come forward to join Malik and Dr. Fisher for the final hour of the flight. Sarah was a brilliant environmental engineer who had met Malik at a conference 6 months after the Flight 847 incident, and their partnership had flourished both personally and professionally as they collaborated on research projects that combined his work on sustainable aviation fuel with her expertise in carbon capture and storage technologies. "How are my two favorite revolutionaries doing?" Sarah asked as she settled into the empty seat across the aisle, her smile lighting up the cabin in a way that reminded Malik daily of how much his life had changed since that morning 2 years earlier, when he had worried about whether he could afford to help his sister with her medical bills while completing his graduate studies. "Are you ready for your speech tomorrow, or are you planning to wing it like you did at the UN? I think I've learned that the most important speeches are often the ones that come from the heart, rather than from careful preparation," Malik replied, reaching across the aisle to take Sarah's hand, as he thought about the words he would share with world leaders about the importance of creating opportunities for talented young people, regardless of their backgrounds or circumstances. "But I do have a few notes about sustainable technology and social justice that I think might resonate with the audience." As Flight 847 began its descent into Geneva, Malik felt a profound sense of completion and anticipation, understanding that he was returning to the city where his career had been launched, but also traveling toward a future that would be defined by his continued commitment to using his success to create pathways for other young people who faced the same barriers and challenges that had once seemed insurmountable to a foster child from Oakland who had dared to dream of becoming a scientist despite everyone who told him he didn't belong in spaces reserved for other kinds of people. The Geneva Convention Center buzzed with the sort of controlled energy that characterizes major international conferences where world leaders and policymakers and business executives gather to discuss challenges that affect billions of lives and to make decisions that will shape global development and environmental protection for decades to come. The World Economic Forum's annual meeting on sustainable technology had drawn participants from 195 countries representing every sector of society and every perspective on the relationship between economic growth and environmental responsibility. Malik Thompson stood backstage in the main auditorium adjusting his tie and reviewing his notes one final time before delivering the keynote address that would close the 3-day conference and set the agenda for international cooperation on climate change and sustainable development for the coming year. His speech titled, "From Exclusion to Innovation, How Diversity Drives Environmental Solutions," would address not just the technical aspects of sustainable aviation technology, but the broader implications of ensuring that scientific research and policy development included voices and perspectives from communities that had been historically marginalized and excluded from decision-making processes. 5 minutes until your introduction, Mr. Thompson, the conference coordinator, said as she approached with the sort of nervous energy that comes from managing events where every detail matters and every moment is being recorded for history. The audience is completely packed with overflow viewing in 3 additional rooms and live streaming to over 2 million viewers worldwide. This is the largest audience we've ever had for a closing keynote. Dr. Fischer watched from his front row seat with the sort of quiet pride that comes from witnessing someone you've mentored achieve success that extends far beyond personal accomplishment to create lasting change for entire communities and future generations. At 83, his health was declining, but his mind remained sharp, and his presence at the conference represented not just support for Malik, but also the international community's recognition of the connections between historical persecution and contemporary discrimination, between individual courage and collective progress. Captain Elena Rodriguez sat in the 3rd row, having flown to Geneva specifically to attend Malik's speech and to participate in a panel discussion about corporate responsibility and ethical leadership that would examine how businesses and institutions could create inclusive environments while maintaining operational excellence and competitive advantage. Her transformation from airline pilot to industry executive had made her a sought-after speaker on topics related to diversity inclusion and the importance of using authority to protect rather than privilege. Sarah Williams operated the recording equipment from the media section documenting Malik's speech for the Thompson-Fischer Foundation's educational archives, while simultaneously live tweeting key quotes and insights for the Foundation's social media followers, who now numbered in the hundreds of thousands and included young people from around the world who had been inspired by the story of Flight 847 to pursue their own dreams despite facing discrimination and barriers in their communities. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conference moderator announced as Malik walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, "it is my honor to introduce Dr. Malik Thompson, whose groundbreaking research on sustainable aviation technology has transformed the aerospace industry, while his advocacy for educational equity has created opportunities for thousands of young people from underrepresented communities to pursue careers in science and engineering." Malik's speech began with the story of Flight 847, not as a tale of victimhood or grievance, but as an illustration of how individual moments of injustice could become catalysts for broader social change when the right people choose to respond with moral courage rather than comfortable indifference. He described Dr. Fischer's decision to speak up against discrimination, Captain Rodriguez's choice to enforce federal regulations regardless of economic considerations, and Miranda Chen's resignation, rather than continue enabling abuse, as examples of the kind of moral leadership that would be required to address global challenges like climate change and environmental degradation. The same systems of exclusion and prejudice that once told a foster child from Oakland that he didn't belong in first class are the same systems that continue to exclude brilliant minds from participating in the research and policy development that will determine our planet's environmental future. Malik told the audience, his voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium and into the overflow rooms where thousands of additional participants were watching on closed-circuit television. We cannot solve global problems with partial participation from global talent. We cannot address climate change without including perspectives from the communities that will be most affected by environmental degradation and economic transition. His presentation included detailed analysis of how the Thompson-Fischer Foundation's scholarship recipients were already contributing to environmental research and sustainable technology development, with young scientists from diverse backgrounds bringing innovative approaches and creative solutions that had not emerged from traditional academic and corporate research programs. The Foundation's success had demonstrated that talent and creativity existed in communities that had been overlooked by conventional recruitment and development systems, and that providing opportunities for underrepresented students produced not just individual success stories, but breakthrough innovations that benefited entire societies. The audience response to Malik's speech was overwhelmingly positive, with standing ovations punctuating his presentation and sustained applause following his conclusion. But the real impact became apparent during the question and answer session that followed, when world leaders and policymakers began making public commitments to implement similar educational and research initiatives in their own countries and institutions. The European Union will be launching a version of the Thompson-Fischer Foundation next year, focused on providing opportunities for refugee and immigrant students to pursue careers in sustainable technology, announced Dr. Maria Santos, the EU's Director of Environmental Policy, her commitment representing the sort of institutional change that could affect thousands of young lives and accelerate global progress toward environmental sustainability. The African Development Bank will be partnering with existing educational institutions to create research opportunities specifically for students from rural communities who have been excluded from traditional academic pathways, added Dr. James Mwangi, whose announcement drew applause from audience members who understood that such initiatives could transform entire regions by developing local expertise and leadership in environmental protection and sustainable development. The ripple effects of Malik's speech extended far beyond the immediate commitments made by conference participants, creating momentum for policy changes and funding initiatives that would be implemented over the coming months and years. Corporate executives announced new diversity and inclusion programs in their research and development departments, while university presidents committed to expanding scholarship and mentorship opportunities for students from underrepresented communities. Victoria Ashworth, meanwhile, watched the conference coverage from the community health clinic in Montana, where she was completing her court-ordered community service. Her reactions to Malik's success, a mixture of resentment and grudging respect, for what he had accomplished since their confrontation on Flight 847. Her transformation during her prison sentence and probation period had been minimal, with counselors and supervisors reporting that she continued to blame external circumstances for her situation, rather than accepting responsibility for the choices that had led to her downfall. The pharmaceutical company that had once borne her family name was now thriving under new leadership that had implemented ethical pricing policies and diversity initiatives that directly contradicted the exclusionary practices and profit maximization strategies that had characterized Victoria's tenure as CEO. The company's stock price had recovered completely from the decline that followed Victoria's arrest, while its reputation for social responsibility and inclusive leadership had attracted top talent and new business partnerships that positioned it for long-term growth and success. Miranda Chen's Workplace Justice Alliance had grown into a national organization with chapters in 47 states, providing legal resources and emotional support for employees who faced discrimination and harassment, while also working with employers to create inclusive work environments that prevented abuse and promoted equality. Her decision to resign on Flight 847 had inspired thousands of other workers to leave toxic situations and seek better opportunities, creating a broader cultural shift toward accountability and respect in workplace relationships. James Parker's training programs for airline crew members had been adopted by carriers around the world, creating standardized protocols for responding to discriminatory passenger behavior while maintaining professional customer service standards and operational efficiency. His experience on Flight 847 had taught him that protecting vulnerable passengers sometimes required challenging powerful customers, and his training emphasized the legal and moral obligations that crew members had to ensure all travelers could fly safely and comfortably. The Thompson-Fischer Foundation had grown from its initial class of 25 scholarship recipients to a nationwide program serving over 1,200 students across all 50 states, with international partnerships that were extending similar opportunities to young people in 12 other countries. The foundation's success had inspired similar initiatives at corporations, universities, and government agencies, creating a network of educational programs designed to identify and develop talent that had previously been overlooked by traditional academic and professional systems. Dr. Fisher's speaking tour about the connections between historical persecution and contemporary discrimination had reached hundreds of thousands of students and community members, creating educational resources and training programs that would teach future generations about the importance of moral courage and civic responsibility in preventing injustice and promoting equality. His partnership with Malik had demonstrated how intergenerational mentorship could create lasting change by combining historical wisdom with contemporary innovation. As the Geneva Conference concluded, and participants prepared to return to their home countries to implement the commitments they had made, Malik reflected on how completely his life had been transformed by the events that had begun with discrimination and humiliation, but had somehow evolved into purpose and possibility. The painful experience on Flight 847 had created opportunities not just for his own advancement, but for systemic changes that would benefit countless other young people who faced similar barriers and challenges. The story of Flight 847 had become more than just an incident about air travel or customer service or corporate accountability. It had become a template for moral courage, a demonstration that individual choices could create broader social change, and proof that ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances could choose justice over convenience, dignity over comfort, and hope over despair. 5 years after the incident, Malik Thompson stands before the United Nations General Assembly as the youngest aerospace engineer ever to address the body about sustainable aviation technology. In the gallery, Dr. Fisher, now 75, but still sharp, watches with tears in his eyes as his protege speaks about turning moments of hatred into catalysts for hope. Captain Rodriguez, recently promoted to airline CEO, has flown in specially to witness this moment. The Thompson-Fischer Foundation has awarded over 2,000 scholarships, fundamentally changing how foster children access higher education in STEM fields. Victoria Ashworth works quietly at a community health clinic in rural Montana, her platinum hair now gray and pulled back simply. The wealth, the connections, the entitled rage all gone. She serves patients who have no idea who she used to be, and perhaps that's her only path to redemption. Miranda's workplace protection legislation has prevented countless others from enduring what she suffered, while James Parker trains flight crews worldwide in the art of dignified intervention. As Malik concludes his UN speech with Dr. Fisher's words about ordinary people choosing courage, the standing ovation echoes something that began in Seat 1A of a commercial flight. Sometimes the smallest acts of human dignity create the largest waves of change. The aircraft that once witnessed hatred has become a symbol of transformation, proving that when faced with our worst impulses, we can still choose to fly higher. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about justice, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. Share your thoughts in the comments below about how conversations across difference have changed your own perspective. Together, we can build bridges of understanding, one story at a time.